Rachel Rose Burkheimer was born on January 16, 1984, in Everettia, Washington. The girl grew up in an intact family. Father Bill and Mother Denise strived to provide everything best for their two daughters. Ray also had an older sister, Megan. Rachel possessed a special charm. She was an attractive, sweet, and approachable young woman. From childhood, Ray participated in all sorts of athletic competitions and was one of the best at it. From an early age, the girl dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, as she deeply loved animals and always tried to help stray cats and dogs. The young woman had many friends. At school, Ray was quite popular, to such an extent that Father Bill even joked that he was his daughter's personal secretary. Friends constantly called on the phone and left messages for Rachel. During the time when the girl was 16 to 17 years old, she was studying in high school, and Rachel experienced more than one tragedy. Within just a year and a half, she lost 6 of her friends. One drowned, another accidentally got caught in a shootout, a third took his own life. All these events greatly affected the previously cheerful young woman, but Rachel was most devastated by the loss of her best friend, Corey Hans. The young man died in a car accident. Rachel and Corey were very close. They behaved like brother and sister, and this grief broke the young woman. The family noticed how Rachel changed dramatically after her best friend's funeral. Ray no longer joked. She became less sociable and ambitious. She stopped making plans for the future. Eventually, by age 18, Rachel decided to drop out of school altogether. Instead, the young woman befriended questionable people, relationships that raised numerous concerns among her acquaintances and relatives. In 2001, Rachel found herself at a party where she met a guy named John Anderson. He was 2 years older than the young woman. John was also a member of a criminal gang. Sweet, well-mannered, sensible Rachel began associating with completely opposite types of people. A group of guys of various ages who had constant trouble with the law. Almost each of them had a criminal record. Robberies, assaults, prohibited substances. The group spent entire days being idle, drinking, and just wandering the streets. Surprisingly, however, the young woman enjoyed her new environment. She was aware of their dark dealings, but never personally participated in anything illegal. Rachel fully understood that her new crowd was very dangerous, so the young woman didn't tell her parents and sister about her new friends. One day, Rachel's father, Bill, received a phone bill for $140. The man was surprised. He assumed it was a mistake. But later it was discovered that Ray had been calling the local jail, where her boyfriend John Anderson was serving his sentence. John had been in custody for several months, but this didn't prevent the young man from keeping in touch with his sweetheart. They spoke on the phone, and John also wrote letters to Rachel. In the letters, the young man described his feelings in a very intense way. Here are several quotes. "You are my whole world. You make my heart beat. I don't think I could ever live without your love. You are special. I would kill 1,000,000 people just to be with you." In one of the letters, John wrote the phrase, "I love you," 33 times. Rachel had to confess that she had a boyfriend, and he was behind bars. Bill tried to discourage his daughter from this relationship. He attempted to explain that such romances never lead to anything good in the future. But the young and naive woman defended John. She saw much good in him and was convinced she could help her boyfriend become better. Megan, Rachel's sister, confided in their parents. Previously, she had noticed that Ray would come home with bruises on her body, and perhaps John was responsible for this. After some time, Rachel's parents decided to try to reason with their younger daughter with Megan's help. One evening, the two sisters began having a heart-to-heart talk. Ray admitted that John was extremely jealous of her. She would visit him in prison. During visits, John would smell her hair, smell her hands, trying to determine if Ray was seeing another man behind his back. In conversation with her sister, Rachel opened up. She broke down crying and admitted that these relationships indeed weighed heavily on her. Ultimately, The young woman decided to break up with John Anderson, acknowledging that this guy was dragging her down. The next day, the young woman informed John about the breakup. She started going to church again, began spending more time with family. One morning, stepping out onto the porch, her father saw his younger daughter. This was the old Rachel again. She was literally glowing. The joy of life had returned to the 18-year-old girl's eyes. Rachel shared good news with her father. Recently, she had met a guy named Maurice Rivas. He was also 18 years old. The young man was raised by his grandmother. It turned out that he too was a member of the gang that John Anderson belonged to. But the young man disliked his environment. Meeting Rachel inspired Morris to do good things. They agreed to return to school together and finish it. The young couple also discussed a future without troubled friends. Maurice asked Ray to help him pull through and become better. The young woman gladly agreed. The friendship with Maurice truly changed Rachel significantly. The young woman felt happy again. It seemed that everything had fallen into place. But that was until John Anderson was released from prison. The first meeting between John and Rachel led to the young people reconciling. They were in a relationship again. But this time, John treated the young woman dismissively. They would break up every day and seemingly make up the next. But everything was cyclical. At some point, Rachel again declared their breakup to John. Moreover, she started dating his friend. For John Anderson, this act amounted to betrayal. John began to hate his former girlfriend. He constantly spoke ill of her to his friends. He started accusing Rachel of allegedly telling their gang's secrets to other people. And over time, most members of the group also began to regard the young woman with suspicion. On September 23, 2002, Rachel Burkheimer was invited to a party. In reality, it was just a regular gang hangout at one of the houses, where young people were simply drinking and playing video games. Rachel was very happy to be invited. She planned to prove herself that evening. Lately, the young woman felt that her friends regarded her poorly. Ray wanted to prove to the guys that she hadn't done anything wrong toward them and remained loyal to their friendship. Around 3 p.m., Rachel, along with her boyfriend Maurice, entered the house where they had been invited earlier. The whole group was in the house. The guys were relaxing, fooling around, and drinking. For about an hour, Rachel, along with Maurice and other gang members, were having fun until John Anderson burst into the room. The young man, clearly intoxicated, started shouting and trying to start a fight. He struck one friend first, then another. Then John pulled out a weapon and everyone present realized the young man had lost control. Tension hung in the air. Rachel froze with fear. The young woman knew John well, knew how dangerous he was, and so she tried to quietly creep toward the door. John immediately realized that Rachel was trying to escape. He grabbed his ex by the hair and threw her to the floor. Suddenly, Rachel Rose heard the command, "Beat her." The young woman felt how literally everyone in the room attacked and started kicking her. One of the men even suggested turning up the radio louder to drown out the unfortunate victim's screams. It turned out that this was a trap. From the very beginning, this party had been carefully planned by John Anderson. The young man had planned this attack while still in prison, when Ray stopped responding to his calls and letters. That's when John became very angry. He persuaded his friend Maurice Rivas to gain his girlfriend's trust. John instructed Maurice to befriend Rachel so that through his friend he could have influence over his ex. Rachel completely trusted Maurice, considering him her friend. Therefore, the young woman wasn't afraid to be back in the bad company where her ex was. It turned out that all the guys had been friends for a very long time. Maurice had even been John's roommate for some time. Also, Maurice was a school friend with Nathan, one of the gang members, and was under the guidance of 32-year-old Yusuf Jihad, who turned out to be the owner of the house where the party was held. Also, Yusuf was the leader of the entire criminal group. Besides these people, 22-year-old Jeffrey Bart and 20-year-old Tony Williams were in the house. In total, besides the young woman, There were 8 guys in the house, and they all beat Rachel, who was begging for mercy. After the gang finished beating their victim, the young men tied her legs and hands and covered her mouth with tape so none of the neighbors could hear the young woman's screams. After this, the young men carried Rachel, bound, to the garage. The thing was, the criminals didn't know what to do next. The revenge plan had been carried out, and now they needed to figure out their next moves. The captured Rachel lay bound in the garage for about 5 hours. During this time, the criminals continued drinking, having fun, and thinking through options for what to do with their friend. Someone suggested asking for ransom for Rachel. Supposedly, her father had money and would certainly want to save his beloved daughter. Someone suggested different harmful actions, but each version proved unsuccessful. The gang members couldn't agree on a single opinion, and therefore just continued relaxing, discussing their acquaintances' further fate. Around 9 in the evening, a young woman entered the garage. It was Yusuf's girlfriend, Teresa Connor. She had just returned home and discovered Rachel tied up in the garage. Teresa snuck into the house. She greeted everyone, pretending not to know about the person tied up in the garage. Teresa went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and went out through the back door. The young woman ran to the garage and started trying to free the bound Rachel, but it turned out that some men had followed her. Several guys also entered the garage, seeing Teresa trying to free their captive. Teresa started yelling at her acquaintances. She demanded that they immediately remove Rachel from here. Just take her away from the house property, or else the young woman threatened to call the police. The guys listened. While part of the gang continued relaxing in the house, other young men took a black gym bag. They put Rachel Rose in it, zipped it up, put the bag in the trunk, and drove away. The criminals started driving aimlessly around the city, trying to decide what to do now with their friend who was tied up in the trunk. Someone suggested that perhaps Ray had already learned her lesson. She would allegedly no longer tell their gang's secrets to outsiders, and she should be released. They could have rented a hotel room and waited until Ray's wounds from the beating healed, and then just let her go. But that didn't happen. At some point, the guys realized that John Anderson wasn't with them, the one who had been the instigator of this whole story from the beginning, and it was John who should decide what to do with Rachel, decide what her future should now be. There wasn't room in the car. Around 11 p.m., the young men parked near a mountain trail. They took out the bag with Rachel Heimer, left Maurice to guard the victim. They themselves went to the house to bring John Anderson. While Maurice and Rachel were alone together, a conversation took place between them. Maurice Rivas opened the bag's zipper, sat down nearby, and started comforting his girlfriend. Rachel begged to be released. She said her parents would pay as much money as needed. Ray sensed trouble, felt that they wanted to do something bad to her. She begged Maurice not to let them drown her. The young man sat nearby and waited for the other gang members. Maurice talked about how they would eventually release Ray and that she shouldn't worry. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then Maurice Rivas zipped up the bag and moved away from it, sat nearby and started waiting for his friends. Meanwhile, the car drove up to the house where the party continued. The young men called for John Anderson. The guy, after smoking a cigarette, headed to the garage. He took several shovels and a pickaxe with him, got in the car, and the young men drove again toward the mountain trail. At the scene, John Anderson and John Whitaker began digging a hole. Maurice stayed by the car, and Anderson became angry about why Maurice wasn't helping dig. At one point, Rachel started crying and sounds began coming from the bag. An enraged John Anderson approached his former girlfriend and struck her with the shovel with all his force to silence her. After some time, John opened the bag, freed Ray, and ordered John Whitaker to undress his ex. But Rachel said no, she would remove all her clothes herself. Along with her clothes, Rachel was ordered to remove all jewelry. The young woman begged to keep the ring on her finger. This ring was given to her by her best friend, the one who died in the car accident. And if she had to die, she wanted to leave life with this precious gift. But John didn't allow this. Rachel followed the order and removed her jewelry. After this, the young woman fell to the ground and began praying. John looked ironically at his ex and said that wasn't worth doing. She would be there soon anyway. John Anderson ordered Rachel Rose to go and lie face down in the grave, which he had dug for her personally. Ray did so. The young woman didn't stop praying. Anderson took out a gun and shot Rachel Rose Burkheimer in the head and back, emptying the entire loaded arsenal. They cynically buried the young woman. On the way home, the young men made a pact with each other. None of those present had the right to tell anyone about the events that happened minutes ago. Otherwise, whoever talked would end up in the same place as the unfortunate Rachel. The next day, John disposed of the gun by throwing it in a nearby pond. The young men put the deceased girl's clothes and jewelry in a pillowcase, planning to burn them. After 2 days, Bill and Denise became worried about their daughter. Previously, the young woman could stay away from home for several days, but she always stayed in touch with them, but not this time. The next morning, the missing girl's parents contacted the police. Immediately, officers organized searches for the missing person. Posters were hung throughout the city. Rachel's disappearance was also announced on local television. Just a day later, interesting information emerged. The mother of one of the gang members, specifically 22-year-old Jeffrey Batau, called the police station. The woman knew well that Rachel was friends with her son and his friends. She reported that the guys often drove Matthew Dorham's car, and perhaps information about the Jeep might somehow help the investigation in searching for the missing girl. 17-year-old Matthew Dorham was immediately called to the station for questioning. They didn't beat around the bush with the young man. Matthew was told that if he confessed right now about where 18-year-old Rachel was, his sentence for informing would be significantly reduced. Matthew could anonymously, quietly, without publicity, tell the police the whole truth. In exchange, the young man was promised leniency. A sincere confession and help in solving the case would help him avoid severe punishment. And Matthew confessed to everything. 17-year-old Matthew turned in all his friends. The teenager described in detail each action of every gang member toward Rachel Rose, what each person's role was in the terrible murder. Since it was already dark on the day of the crime, Matthew showed the approximate burial site of the victim, and with the help of dogs, they managed to find Rachel's grave. The young woman was lying in the hole with folded hands, as she hadn't stopped praying until the last second. When police arrived at Yusuf's house with a search warrant, officers found the pillowcase with the victim's belongings there. They had tried to burn the personal items, but weren't able to do it completely. Everything that Matthew told at the police station matched reality. All 8 gang members who were involved in Rachel's murder were arrested that same day. Of the 8 guys, 5 made deals. They admitted their guilt in order to have the possibility of receiving a shorter sentence. 16-year-old Nathan was charged with conspiracy and aiding in committing the crime. The young man didn't participate in the murder, so he spent only 30 days behind bars. 20-year-old Tony, who beat Rachel and taped her mouth, and also turned up the radio to drown out the victim's screams, was sentenced to 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey, whose mother called the police, who drove the car with the girl tied up in the trunk, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. 17-year-old Matthew, who was driving the car, was sentenced to 26 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice, who directly participated in the conspiracy against Rachel, was sentenced to 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Yusuf, who owned the house where it all started, was sentenced to 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was found guilty on all charges. The man faced the death penalty, but since he admitted his guilt and cooperated with police, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. 20-year-old John Anderson, who planned revenge on his ex-girlfriend, behaved shockingly in court. The young man constantly smiled at the cameras, sometimes even laughing demonstratively. But the most horrible thing was that he looked toward Rachel's family and winked at them. John Anderson also faced the death penalty, but since he fully admitted his guilt, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Sometimes the desire to create a family and be loved can have quite adverse consequences. Ellie's dreams of a happy future were shattered one dark night on the remote shore of Lake Sardis. Despite the party at the bar being in full swing, Ellie Kostial, a 21-year-old University of Mississippi student, hurriedly prepared to head home. Her girlfriends tried to persuade her to stay a bit longer, but the young woman remained adamant. Stepping outside, she immediately pulled her mobile phone from her purse and texted someone that she would be there soon. Ellie was very excited about the upcoming meeting, as today, one could say, her destiny was being decided. The young woman didn't yet know that this night would be her last. She hailed a taxi and, after giving the address of her apartment, happily rode home. This story will serve as a warning to many young people who haven't yet learned to solve their problems independently. It's crucial for parents to explain to their child that no matter what happens, they can always count on support from mom and dad in everything. Alexandria Madison Kostial, or Ellie as her loved ones called her, was born September 11, 1997, to parents Cindy and Keith. She grew up alongside her younger brother Andrew in St. Louis, Missouri. From childhood, Ellie was the most optimistic child, literally radiating love and joy through her entire demeanor. The girl treated strangers with the same warmth and kindness that she showed when interacting with her family. Ellie was one of those people who instantly lifted spirits just by their presence and genuine smile. Friends described Ellie as a light that never ceased to shine. Ellie was not only a wonderful daughter, sister, and friend, but also a successful athlete and gifted student. From 2012 to 2016, she was a member of the track and field team and golf team, youth government support group, and National Honor Society. She had time for everything. Outside of school and sporting events, Ellie also enjoyed yoga and participated in half marathons. During school breaks, the young woman traveled as a volunteer to Peru and Africa to help small children learn to speak English. Don't be afraid to be who you are. This was the core principle that Ellie lived by and encouraged others to follow the same advice. She accepted people with all their character traits, was an incredibly loyal friend, and wasn't afraid to show her true nature. It was for all these qualities that people loved Ellie. They simply felt comfortable around her. After finishing high school, Ellie enrolled in the University of Mississippi's Ole Miss College in Oxford. This was what she had dreamed of since childhood, and the dream had finally come true. There were several reasons why she had always wanted to go there. First, Ellie was drawn to the preppy style that the school offered. This was a distinctive fashion style that originated from the uniforms of prestigious private school students, preparing to enter elite higher education institutions. The young woman loved the color pink and adored pearls. She was enchanted when the sun would sink below the horizon and illuminate the sky with rosy reflections. Ellie even created a social media page dedicated to sunsets, which she constantly photographed. Of course, she had other more significant reasons why she loved the University of Mississippi and wanted to study there. She appreciated the college's own traditions. She was fond of the distinguished professors, the overall atmosphere, and the presence of a major football team. Ellie enrolled at Ole Miss in fall 2016. Her aspirations extended far beyond obtaining a specialization in business and marketing. The young woman wanted to finally achieve results not only in terms of her career, but also in finding personal happiness. She thought college was the perfect place to meet her future life partner. Besides studying, Ellie also decided to join the Alpha Kappa Psi Women's Club and the business community. She founded and led a golf club and in her free time taught yoga and Pilates. Naturally, her day was scheduled down to the minute, but most importantly, her studies didn't suffer. The only thing Ellie lacked was a boyfriend. Many high school students, when entering college, dream of meeting someone there with whom they'll continue through life. Ellie dreamed of the same things as most of her peers. She loved Southern boys and Southern culture and hoped that studying in Mississippi would help her find a young man with whom she would spend the rest of her life, have a successful marriage, create a happy family, and have her own children. In high school, Ellie had boys she was in love with, but there was never anything serious between them. Even to the prom, she went not accompanied by a date, but paired with a girlfriend. And finally, Ellie's dream came true. She got a boyfriend. It was her classmate, Brandon Thiesfeld, a freshman from Fort Worth, Texas. Ellie fell for him instantly, and throughout their freshman year at Ole Miss, they spent a lot of time together. The young woman invited him to most parties organized by her sorority. Although many said that Ellie and Brandon dated occasionally, they were never officially boyfriend and girlfriend, never arranged dates for each other, and never planned to spend their lives together. There were even times when the young man would block his friend's number for several weeks or even months. The fact was that both students viewed the relationship completely differently. Ellie liked the guy from the moment they first met. She thought the attraction was mutual. Ellie probably wanted more than just companionship. She hoped that one day everything would change and Brandon would see in her that special someone to walk through life with. Ellie dreamed of officially becoming his girlfriend, graduating college, and someday marrying him. However, from Brandon's perspective, this was just a casual, intimate relationship. He was a different type of person, usually called a player. He had several girls simultaneously and made each one think their connection would grow into something more, though in reality, he simply didn't want serious relationships. Brandon was an extremely manipulative person who clearly kept Ellie around to satisfy his intimate fantasies. He was well aware that the girl liked him and used this to his advantage. To explain why they couldn't be together, he would say he wasn't good enough for her. The couple's relationship resembled an emotional roller coaster. One minute, Ellie could be very excited and happy, and the next, she would be upset and crying. Brandon never visited her home and wasn't familiar with most of her friends. Many hadn't even heard his surname, so all that Ellie's close friends knew was what she told them. And apparently, Ellie kept much to herself. She rarely told anyone about what was really happening between them. Facing Brandon's manipulations, Ellie often felt lonely. Earlier, the young woman shared absolutely everything with her mother, Cindy. The woman knew her daughter liked a young man from her course, and although Ellie continued to confide in her mother, she never spoke about her relationship with Brandon. People in love often see situations in a completely different light. Ellie probably didn't even realize that Brandon was manipulating her. She noticed only good things in every person. Ellie looked at the world through rose-colored glasses. This didn't mean she was foolish. She was only 19 years old. She was away from her parents for the first time, and for the first time received attention from a boy she liked. Though the love-struck Ellie continued to pursue Brandon, in what happened to her, she bears no blame whatsoever. Let's move to summer 2019, when Ellie was approaching her final year of college. She had turned 21 and spent the entire summer living on campus. She attended summer classes, engaged in extracurricular activities, and spent time with friends on campus. In early July, her parents came to visit her. The young woman was overjoyed to spend time with them. They worked together to set up her new apartment off campus. They went shopping, prepared home-cooked meals, and enjoyed each other's company. Ellie missed them so much that she begged Mom and Dad to stay at least one more day. But her parents needed to return to St. Louis. Her mother, Cindy, later recalled that saying goodbye to her daughter that time was particularly difficult, though the parents had no idea it would be the last time in their lives. Nevertheless, Ellie called them regularly to chat and share news. On July 19, 2019, the young woman once again dialed their home number. It was around 7 in the evening. Actually, Ellie had just woken up. She had an important test in the morning, so she had studied extensively the night before and then fallen asleep during the day. She told her mom that later that evening she planned to meet friends at a bar. Overall, it was a completely ordinary conversation with no signs of the impending tragedy. Mom Cindy couldn't even imagine that she was talking to her daughter for the last time. And in just a few hours, their life would change forever. Later that night, at 11:52 p.m., cameras at one of the businesses on Oxford Square recorded Ellie Kostial leaving the bar alone. She could be seen looking at her phone screen while walking in the opposite direction from the establishment. Later, a taxi picked her up, and the driver safely delivered Ellie home after midnight. But she was already in danger at that point, because the plan for her destruction had been set in motion. On the morning of July 20th, 2019, a Lafayette County deputy sheriff was conducting routine patrol in Harmontown near Lake Sardis, located 30 miles north of the Ole Miss campus. It was there, at an abandoned fishing spot by the water, that a standard patrol turned into a crime investigation. At 10:23 a.m., the officer stumbled upon the body of a young woman. It was clear that she had been shot multiple times. The officer could no longer do anything to save her. Very soon, the victim was identified as 21-year-old Ole Miss College student Alexandria Kostial. Later, the medical examiner determined that she had been shot a total of 9 times. This was the cause of her death. It all happened while the young woman was sitting on a picnic bench, and the shots were fired from different directions, as if the perpetrator was walking in a circle. At the crime scene, investigators found 11 spent shell casings, as well as Ellie's purse, discarded in a ditch near where her body lay. Inside, they found her student ID and driver's license, which helped police quickly identify the victim. Additionally, this gave them an idea of where she lived. Officers contacted Ellie's friends and family, searched her apartment, and the only item they couldn't locate was the victim's mobile phone. Police tried to ping its location via GPS and only received a point in Oxford. Fortunately, Ellie wore an Apple Watch that synchronized with her mobile. The watch was found in her apartment and gave detectives a lead for further investigation. Text messages coming to the mobile phone were duplicated on the electronic watch, so investigators were able to determine who the young woman had been messaging before her death. It was a single person, her classmate, 22-year-old Brandon Theisfeld. Moreover, they weren't just texting that evening, but arranging to meet after Ellie left the bar, leaving her friends to continue having fun. If the messages themselves weren't enough to indicate the guy's involvement in the student's murder, when talking with Ellie's friends, the boyfriend's name came up first when they were asked who might want to harm Ellie, while Brandon's roommate described him as an arrogant misogynist who often made vulgar, crude comments about female classmates. All signs pointed to Brandon, so investigators called him and asked him to come to the police station to answer a few questions. The guy agreed but didn't show up for questioning at the appointed time. When they called him again, he explained that he had drunk too much the night before, so he didn't want to meet with detectives while intoxicated. When Ellie's case investigators scheduled a meeting for the next morning, Brandon agreed, but again failed to appear at the station at the appointed time. Officers quickly discovered that this time Brandon had gone on the run. They obtained a warrant for his arrest and declared him wanted. Operatives managed to track the movement of Brandon's mobile phone and his credit card transactions. Through these records, police learned that the student was heading toward Memphis, Tennessee. A description of Brandon's vehicle was sent to the Memphis Police Department's fugitive task force. And that same evening, the guy was arrested when he stopped at a gas station. This happened just 3 days after Ellie's death. In his pickup truck was a .40 caliber pistol, matching the weapon used to shoot Ellie. Brandon himself had blood on his shirt, although the student insisted on his innocence and maintained he wasn't involved in Ellie's death. Police ultimately charged him with murder. After his arrest, the young man was extradited back to Mississippi, where he was held without bail. He refused to talk without a lawyer. Investigators decided to track Brandon's actions on the weekend when Ellie was killed. They learned that the guy had met with friends, the students went bowling together. Everything was very ordinary. On Sunday, Brandon came to a friend's house with a pistol. There was nothing unusual about this either. He brought a 6-pack of beer. They drank and did some target practice at empty cans. When his friend woke up the next morning, Brandon was already gone. Brandon had a life full of promise. He was raised in a good Christian family and received lots of love. His parents worked as doctors. His father owned his own clinic. It seemed the guy had a typical Texas childhood. Brandon enjoyed spending time outdoors, hunting, fishing. In school, he played football and was never noticed showing any violence. The young man had never even gotten into a single fight. Soon after enrolling at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Brandon met Ellie at a bar. It was immediately clear to anyone that Ellie liked Brandon much more than he liked her. Their relationship became complicated when both were sophomores. Due to the large number of messages from Ellie that she wrote to him, the guy even blocked her phone number. But then something changed, and these two started communicating again. Meanwhile, as the investigation continued, more than 100 people gathered to honor the memory of Alexandria Kostial. Many people said that she was a true bright light in their lives, and now that light had gone out, but it would continue to shine in each of their hearts. This sweet girl clearly didn't deserve what happened to her. After the vigil on July 27, 2019, a funeral was held at Concordia Lutheran Church, where all of Ellie's close ones and relatives gathered again to bid the young woman a final farewell. They all wondered who could have been threatened by the cheerful, positive student, and the answer was clear: Brandon Theisfeld. On July 23rd, Brandon first appeared in court, where he was officially charged with Ellie's murder. But how could a love-struck student have threatened the guy so much that he dared to commit such a vile crime? Investigators hoped to find answers to some questions in the hundreds of text messages between the young people. The reason turned out to be much sadder than anyone could have imagined. It turned out that in April 2019, just 3 months before her death, Ellie was preparing for her spring semester final exams. What neither her family nor friends knew was that the student was focused on another type of test, a pregnancy test. Ellie wrote to Brandon that she was late and suspected a certain situation. The first message about this was sent on April 12th, to which the guy asked her to keep this information secret from friends and parents for now. 2 days later, Ellie sent Brandon a photo of a pregnancy test. The fact was that the test could be called neither positive nor negative. The second line was barely visible, and the situation could be interpreted differently. Along with the pregnancy test photo, Ellie also quite reasonably asked if they could meet in person to talk. At first, the young man ignored Ellie's message completely, but when he did respond, he was clear and concise in his decision. Brandon took this news categorically. Not only did he have no intention of meeting with Ellie, but he also expressed his specific desire. If the girl actually turned out to be pregnant, he wanted her to fix the situation immediately, suggesting she take a pill. 22-year-old Brandon clearly stated that he didn't want to have a child at all because it would ruin his life. He wasn't going to help Ellie if she decided to keep the baby. And even if it seemed like a harsh and cruel decision to her, he would never change his mind. Brandon was adamant in his conviction and kept telling Ellie again and again from April through August that he didn't want to tie his future life to hers. But the young woman only asked for a meeting and a face-to-face conversation. He continued to avoid her, and eventually, communication was reduced to just electronic messages. Several times they set up dates, but each time the guy canceled at the last minute and didn't show up. Ellie, despite the ambiguous test result, continued writing to Brandon day and night. Many of her messages were long, candid, and quite disturbing. Finding herself in a difficult situation, Ellie was afraid to tell her parents about it and tried as best she could to hide from her pain and confusion about what to do next. According to her messages, the young woman even tried to drink a large amount of alcohol to end all her torment at once. At one point, she wrote that she had drunk a full bottle of tequila and 2 bottles of champagne, 7 cans of beer, and a glass of wine. Ellie wanted to get alcohol poisoning, and although it became clear to any reasonable person that she was clearly exaggerating, at the same time, this was a kind of cry for help and support from someone close to her. This showed how desperately she needed his attention and support from Brandon. However, instead of this, Brandon continued to coldly state that he didn't want this child and repeatedly refused to meet Ellie in person. He didn't care what was happening to her. Such behavior said a lot about his character. In reality, Brandon was only interested in himself. Many considered him a daddy's boy because the guy constantly flaunted the fact that his father's money could get him out of any trouble. Only this time, he was badly mistaken. When it came to evidence against Brandon, there was plenty. Besides the bullet casings matching his pistol, blood on his shirt, and text messages confirming that he and Ellie did meet that night, there was also a letter. After the arrest, police searched Brandon's apartment and found a handwritten message to the guy's parents. In this letter, he didn't directly confess to the murder, but indirectly spoke about the committed crime. Brandon was troubled by what he had done. He wrote to his mother and father that he was a bad person, but it wasn't the parents' fault. He had always been visited by terrible thoughts, fueled by alcohol and prohibited substances, and for him, this was the end. He would either go to prison or die. The guy felt that he would be caught sooner or later anyway. Later, Brandon's lawyer stated that this was Brandon's suicide note, and that after killing Ellie, he had planned to take his own life as well. But the attempt was unsuccessful. Allegedly, the guy had already put the gun to his head, and then lost consciousness. However, regardless of the letter's purpose, it was just one piece of evidence indicating his guilt. During the investigation, detectives uncovered several other things indicating that the crime was planned in advance. A week before Ellie's death, on Friday, July 12th, Brandon traveled from Oxford to Fort Worth to his parents' house to retrieve his pistol. He photographed the weapon and posted it on his account with the caption, "Finally bringing my baby back to Oxford." The investigators also reviewed Brandon's internet search history and discovered truly frightening queries. In the week leading up to Ellie's murder, the student had Googled how to get away with committing a crime, how to plan a murder, how to tie people up, and how to lure them into a trap. He also searched for tactical face masks, full metal jacket ammunition, and gun silencers. And the most horrifying thing was that he actually managed to lure his victim by deception, making Ellie think he was finally ready to talk about the pregnancy. Brandon's lawyer insisted that the internet search history still didn't prove that Brandon planned to shoot Ellie. And there was an innocent explanation for why his client brought a gun with him to Mississippi. In his opinion, there was nothing unusual about people shooting. There were ranges in Oxford where the student wanted to practice shooting, but prosecutors were clear that Brandon's trip to Texas and computer searches were part of a carefully crafted plan. On July 17, 2019, Brandon initiated a conversation with Ellie for the first time since April. He pretended he wanted to talk about the pregnancy situation. On Thursday, July 18th, shortly before 2 a.m., Ellie sent Brandon a message with a photo of her belly. For the guy, this message could have been the last straw. He became so frightened that he decided to immediately execute his plan and permanently eliminate the problem. That day, Brandon asked if Ellie's friends would be around when he visited her. The young woman thought he wanted to maintain confidentiality because it was a very delicate topic for discussion, and happily and nervously agreed to meet without witnesses. She felt enormous relief that they were finally going to talk about her pregnancy. But in reality, Brandon merely wanted to ensure that Ellie would be home alone and no one would guess that she had left with him. Eventually, on the 19th, he confirmed the time once more. The young people agreed to meet after Ellie returned home from the bar. She promised to leave early so that no one would interrupt their conversation. Brandon's truck with its distinctive license plate was spotted on surveillance footage driving toward Ellie's house at 1:14 a.m. The same camera recorded the vehicle when it was moving in the opposite direction. GPS data showed that Ellie's and Brandon's mobile phones were close to each other as they drove through Oxford toward Lake Sardis. On the previous day, the young man had been drinking all day, and after arriving at the location, he continued hitting the bottle. He and Ellie sat at a picnic table talking about her pregnancy. Brandon had some white powder in his car. Getting angry about the conversation, he went to his truck and used the substance, after which he returned to the table with a pistol in his hand and began shooting. Ellie was shot at least 9 times in total, with 1 bullet lodging in the table. Witnesses heard several shots in the vicinity between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m. And at 10:03 a.m., according to GPS, both mobile phones returned toward Oxford. Then, less than an hour later, Brandon searched the internet for information about how to monitor police channels, after which he tried to find news related to Lake Sardis, Mississippi. Over the next few hours, both mobiles pinged from the same towers until Ellie's phone eventually lost signal. Apparently, Brandon turned off the device and disposed of it, while he meanwhile went to hang out with friends, drink beer, and show off his pistol as if nothing terrible had happened. Fortunately, he soon faced the consequences of his actions. By August 2019, Brandon's name made front-page news. That's when the case was presented to the grand jury, and everyone was shocked by what happened. University professors, students, and ordinary Oxford residents. On August 22nd, Brandon appeared in court for a bail hearing. However, his lawyer ultimately withdrew the request and instead asked the judge to order a psychological evaluation for his client. Apparently, the lawyer decided to slow down the case by presenting Brandon as someone with mental health issues to reduce his sentence for the crime. The judge approved both requests. This meant he would continue to hold Brandon in jail without bail, and also order a psychological assessment of his condition. And outside the courtroom, Ellie's devastated loved ones and friends gathered. They continued to do this until justice prevailed. The Kostial family deeply grieved the loss of their daughter. After her tragic death, parents Cindy and Keith refused to read Ellie's messages with Brandon discovered by investigators because they blamed themselves for not noticing their child's emotional torment and overlooking her dire situation. But it would have been even more painful for them to read how heartlessly the guy their daughter was in love with treated her. While Ellie's friends and family waited for Brandon Theisfeld to face trial for his crime, prosecutors built their case. They hoped the text messages between the students could provide insight into what might have led to the young woman's death. About a week later, on August 30th, 2019, Brandon returned to court where he was formally charged with the kidnapping of Alexandria Kostial and murder punishable by death penalty in Mississippi. The psychological evaluation found the student sane and competent to stand trial. Ultimately, the defendant pleaded not guilty, despite all the evidence against him. By that time, 2020 had arrived, and due to the pandemic, there were serious delays in the judicial system, so his trial had to be postponed. By the time it finally took place, Brandon had changed his mind and decided to take a plea deal. On August 27, 2021, Brandon pleaded guilty to taking Alexandria Kostial's life in exchange for a lighter sentence. State authorities agreed to reduce his punishment, knowing that securing a death sentence would be much more difficult and require far more evidence. So the former student will have to spend his entire life behind bars. When it came to the motive for the crime, Brandon's lawyer stated that his client was driven by a desire to eliminate the problem. Brandon thought he would become a father and wanted to end it in his own way. His intention was aggravated by the fact that he was drunk and under the influence of prohibited substances. However, this did not elicit sympathy from the jury. The most terrible thing about this story is that the results of the home pregnancy tests that Ellie showed Brandon were inconclusive. One clearly visible line and a second barely noticeable one. The situation could be interpreted in two ways, but Ellie's autopsy report gave a definitive result. The young woman was not pregnant. Unfortunately, no one will ever know if Ellie could have been pregnant several months before her death. According to a text message she sent Brandon in early July, Ellie said she had bleeding. It's quite possible she had a miscarriage due to the stress she endured. Perhaps the young woman so desperately wanted to marry her loved one that she took wishful thinking for reality. But if Ellie could have known that Brandon was capable of taking her life just to avoid responsibility for the consequences of their intimate relationship, she would hardly have insisted on meeting and would never have voluntarily gotten into his truck. It was already late at night when Shona returned home after her shift at the casino. She unlocked the door to her apartment with her key and immediately sensed that something wasn't right inside. Everything appeared to be in its place, but someone had clearly moved things around. Shona rushed to her room to check if her jewelry had been stolen, and everything seemed fine at first glance. She sorted through her earrings, necklaces, and hair clips, only then noticing that her wedding ring, which she had taken off just a couple of months ago, was missing. Strange. Why would someone take the ring when there were other valuable items there? The woman walked through the apartment trying to figure out what else was gone. Opening her underwear drawer, Shona realized someone had been going through it too. In the bottom drawer, where she kept her summer clothes, the bottom piece of her swimsuit was missing. Who could have needed that? While going through her clothes, the apartment owner unexpectedly came across something that definitely didn't belong to her. It was a pair of men's boxer shorts in a small size. How could they have gotten into her home? What exactly had happened here? Shona Tiaffey had no idea yet that this bizarre burglary was merely a rehearsal for her death. Shona Ann Castleton was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah, to William and Nancy. She had a sister, Paula, and 5 brothers. Shona's parents were Mormon, so from childhood, all their children viewed church as an essential and mandatory part of their lives. In 1978, the Castletons moved to Pennsylvania, and 2 years later to Northern Virginia, where Shona attended middle and then high school. Despite both moves occurring during her adolescent years, she navigated this period with ease. In each school, Shona quickly made friends and adapted to her new surroundings. The reason for this was the schoolgirl's cheerful disposition, which she maintained throughout her entire life. Positive people always attracted attention, and the young woman was also physically attractive. Wherever Shona found herself, she maintained an optimistic attitude most of the time, was very outgoing and caring. For instance, she would buy and bring cupcakes to work for her colleagues on their birthdays, to give them a bit of attention on such an important occasion, so it was very easy to grow fond of her. Shona's genuine smile and infectious laughter, that's exactly what her close friends and family would remember for the rest of their lives. For someone as vibrant and cheerful as Shona, Las Vegas was the perfect place to live. That's exactly where the 28-year-old woman relocated in 1994. Initially, she found work in the cosmetics department at Fifth Avenue, but this wasn't quite the job Shona had dreamed of. She wanted to be part of Vegas's nightlife, so she soon became a cocktail waitress at a newly opened casino. Shona worked there for the next 11 years. The cheerful and smiling waitress was beloved not only by her colleagues, but also by the establishment's patrons. In the early 2000s, she earned over $100 annually in salary and tips, so the woman had good reason to put in the effort. Shona's charming appearance and genuine smile attracted casino regulars. She often received attention and date invitations, but she waited for her one true love and wasn't in a hurry to start a casual romance. And then one day, it happened. About a year into working at the casino, Shona's eyes met those of a handsome man. He was tall, had a fit, athletic build, and smiled warmly at her. His charisma was incredible. The man's name was George Tiaffey, and he worked at the Las Vegas Fire Department. From the first days, a passionate romance blossomed between Shona and George. To her, it seemed like he was the one she'd been waiting for all her life. A man who looked like he stepped off a firefighter calendar. He wasn't just handsome and strong, but had dedicated his life to such a dangerous and noble profession. George was practically perfect. At his high school graduation, he had been crowned prom king. Then the young man entered the United States Military Academy, and after graduating served in the Army Corps of Engineers, building schools and water supply systems in third-world countries. The young man sent most of his earned money home to his mother to help her care for his disabled sister. The more Shona learned about George, the deeper she fell in love. The man wasn't just physically attractive, but also beautiful in spirit. Just a year after their first meeting, they were welcoming their daughter into the world, whom they named Madison. For the next several years, everyone who knew George and Shona considered them the perfect couple. The man surrounded his girls with love and care, while Shona, now a mother, literally glowed with happiness. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. The birth of her daughter became the woman's main priority in life. She tried to spend every free minute with her little one. They played together, laughed, fooled around, and sang songs. Because both parents often worked night shifts, Madison frequently stayed at her grandmother's house. When picking up her daughter from her mother-in-law, the girl's mom tried to make up for lost time. When Madison turned 3, George and Shona finally got married. In March 2006, the newlyweds held a private wedding ceremony in Hawaii, just a few days after Shona's 40th birthday. In photos from that day, they truly looked like the perfect family, happy and in love with each other. In their joyful faces, it was impossible to see the terrible future that awaited them. The first few years after the wedding, Shona and George indeed seemed content with married life, but unfortunately, it didn't last long. After the Tiaffeys lost a significant amount of money during the 2008 economic downturn and housing crisis, George transformed from a loving husband into a jealous and bitter aggressor. The man Shona had once been head over heels in love with had now become a completely different person. The woman told her friends that he had become incredibly critical of everything she did. He started counting how much money she spent and humiliated her at every opportunity. Once, he crossed all boundaries. When Shona was getting ready for work, he called her a woman of ill repute, and he did this right in front of their daughter Madison. George was most concerned about the family's financial problems. In reality, the man disliked the fact that Shona was now the main breadwinner in the household. This made him feel inadequate and insecure about his own abilities. For this reason, George began to strictly control how his wife spent money, most of which she had earned herself in the first place. All this affected their relationship and created tension in the family. The way George treated Shona was very hurtful to her and destroyed all warm feelings towards him. With each new month and year after the economic crisis, these problems only continued to grow. As if to spite his wife, George befriended a homeless drifter and hired him to do some yard work. Despite the fact that his wife was against having strangers on the property, Shona was often home alone with her daughter when this unknown man was doing something outside. He behaved in a way that made the homeowner feel very uncomfortable. It's unknown what thoughts visited his mind. The drifter's mere glance sent shivers through Shona's body. The woman repeatedly told her husband how uncomfortable she felt in her own home when this guy was lurking nearby. But George, it seemed, didn't care at all. Shona had imagined married life quite differently. In her mind, she still held the picture of a cute, cozy house with a white picket fence, a loving and beloved man by her side, and happy children. But instead, she saw complete indifference from her husband. The Tiaffeys' marriage was simply falling apart. This was difficult for Shona, who had never noticed this other side of George's personality before. The woman was very upset that her fairy tale was crumbling before her eyes, but she had no strength left to endure the humiliation any longer. Hope that life would improve was becoming increasingly dim. Finally, in April 2012, everything became so bad that Shona decided to leave. She agreed to share custody of their daughter, yet even at this point, the woman wasn't ready to stop fighting for their marriage. She was an optimist to her core and still left a small chance that their relationship with George could be revived. Shona even attempted to go to marriage counseling with her husband. Unfortunately, it was then that she finally understood it was too late to do anything. In the summer of 2012, many changes occurred in Shona's life. The woman excelled at her job, adapted to her new routine, and made sure that little Madison wanted for nothing. Mother and daughter settled into their new city apartment in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes from work. In the townhouse, each resident had their own separate entrance and car garage. The apartment could be accessed through the garage or from the street. Shona was quite satisfied with this dwelling and tried to turn it into a cozy nest for herself and her child. A positive outlook on life helped Shona survive here too. Though she lost her husband, she was still with Madison and could go to her beloved job. Despite the long workday that sometimes ended very late, the cocktail waitress position was Shona's salvation. Despite family troubles, the smile never left the woman's face. She continued to look for positive moments in everything. One time in early September, Shona finished her casino shift as usual and headed home. Just stepping inside, she immediately realized someone had been there before her. It couldn't even be called a burglary, since of all valuable items only her wedding ring was missing. But even stranger, the bottom piece of her swimsuit had disappeared. Instead, the intruder had left behind men's boxer shorts in a small size. The whole situation was so absurd and personal that Shona didn't even know what should be done in such cases. It was very unpleasant and offensive that some stranger had gone through her belongings and then left their underwear behind. Someone had broken into the home, but it was unclear what goal they were pursuing. However frightened Shona was, she was saved by that same optimistic mindset that everything would somehow work itself out. Yet due to her own carelessness, she didn't take any additional measures to secure her home. The thought that someone would break into her apartment again seemed too incredible to Shona. And despite the shock, the woman continued living as if nothing had happened. However, this time, Shona's confidence that everything would be fine worked against her, because just 3 weeks later, someone again entered the woman's residence, and not with the intention to rob. Early on the morning of September 29th, 2012, casino surveillance cameras captured 46-year-old Shona Tiaffey finishing her shift around 3 a.m. and heading home. In the parking lot, the woman got into her car and made the 30-minute drive to suburban Summerlin. Unfortunately, she never made it safely to her bed that night. When Shona parked her car in the garage and headed to her apartment, she was brutally attacked right on the stairwell. The attacker showed no mercy and left only after ensuring that Shona had died. Her body was discovered only 6 hours later, around 9 a.m., after George finished his 24-hour shift at the fire station and picked up his daughter from his mother's house. The girl had spent the night at her grandmother's because both Shona and George had worked late, which was common practice. 8-year-old Madison was supposed to spend that day with her father, but she forgot something at her mom's apartment and asked her dad to stop by Shona's townhouse to get it. George noticed from a distance that the garage door wasn't locked. Nevertheless, he and Madison entered the apartment and immediately stumbled upon Shona's beaten body lying on the living room floor. Her face was covered in blood. The man quickly led his daughter back outside, immediately called 911, and reported all the details of what happened. George mentioned that he had last seen Shona about 36 hours ago. For the past few months, he and his wife had been living separately, so he had no idea who would want to attack her. The paramedics who arrived at the scene could no longer help the apartment owner. They only pronounced Shona Tiaffey's death. George himself hadn't even bothered to check his wife's pulse, hurrying to get outside with his daughter. Due to the large amount of blood, police initially thought the victim had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. Upon further examination, they realized that Shona had received multiple blows to the head with a heavy, blunt object. In total, they counted 17 strikes. The fingers on her right hand were broken. Apparently, the woman had tried to shield her head with her hand. According to neighbor interviews, the attack occurred between 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the morning. During this time, one man had heard some noise coming from the deceased's apartment, but hadn't paid proper attention. The brutal crime shocked the Summerlin community and disturbed Shona's colleagues. Some people believed that any casino worker could have been the target, and the maniac wouldn't stop at one victim. Naturally, the first suspect was former husband George Tiaffey, from whom Shona was in the process of divorcing. He had clear motive and opportunity. However, his candidacy had to be ruled out quickly since the man was on a 24-hour shift at the fire station where several colleagues had seen him. This was a solid alibi that cleared George of any suspicion. Investigators crossed the man off their list of potential perpetrators, but when Shona's sister learned of the tragedy, she was 100% certain it was his doing. In Paula's opinion, George was the only person capable of harming his wife, and she remained adamant in her conviction despite the alibi. Paula and her husband got on a plane and flew to Las Vegas that same day. However, detectives considered other suspects as potential perpetrators. Learning from Shona's close ones that someone had recently broken into her apartment but stolen nothing valuable except the wedding ring and swimsuit bottom, police theorized it could have been some random admirer obsessed with the victim. Perhaps he had followed her from the casino and attacked when she was opening her front door. As mentioned earlier, Shona was one of those women who inadvertently attracted attention not only with her appearance, but also her charisma. Could some rejected admirer have taken revenge for her coldness? This was the question police had to investigate. The investigation into Shona Tiaffey's tragic death instantly gained momentum. Just 48 hours later, police received a call from a chance witness that enabled them to solve this case in record time. The caller was named William Penix, known as Big Will. William had lived in Las Vegas for many years and worked as a maintenance master for an apartment building. Recently, he had received an urgent call from a friend who was eager to brag about something. A couple of hours later, this friend showed up at Big Will's place, barely containing his joy, and told him that last night he had sent a woman to the other world. He was happy, as if he had just completed some mission for which he would be paid a lot of money. He would leave town and start living a wealthy life. When William asked how he had disposed of the woman, his friend explained that he had beaten her to death with a hammer. He kept striking until the tool in his hands broke in half. During the story, his friend laughed with pleasure, as if he had committed a heroic deed, and this infuriated William. Big Will tried to live a righteous life under the Lord's authority, as he put it, and often helped people released from prison return to a normal path. That's why Will didn't like the story his friend told. This went beyond the type of people the man was willing to help. The next morning, Will heard news about a local woman beaten to death in her own home. So he decided to report the crime to police. At first, William's message seemed too implausible to detectives. Nevertheless, police decided to check the lead and find out who this person was who had killed the woman with a hammer. Big Will's friend was named Nail Stevens. He lived in a tent somewhere at the foot of the hills, away from the glittering lights of downtown. Stevens was a former inmate, and Big Will had been helping him get his life back on track. However, now he wasn't saving, but rather wanted to bring Stevens to justice. Since William didn't know his friend's actual address, he led police to a grocery store where Stevens often hung around. and by coincidence, detectives encountered the suspect right on the street. Officers arrested Stevens for possession of prohibited substances found on him and brought him in for questioning at the police station. The homeless man denied having anything to do with Shona Tiaffey's murder. He shouted that police had the wrong guy, and detectives indeed doubted that the perpetrator they were looking for was before them. They couldn't understand what could connect this vagrant with a respectable woman. Neil Stevens had always been a lawbreaker, but he was a petty offender. At this point, he was free. All his previous crimes had not been associated with violence. He stole, sold prohibited substances, and sometimes engaged in hooliganism. Moreover, this person had no connection to Shona Tiaffey. Essentially, he had no motive to harm her. To confirm their reasoning, detectives decided to locate Stevens's temporary dwelling and search it for physical evidence. While the vagrant was being held in custody on drug possession charges, police began an extensive search for his campsite. They brought in a helicopter and search team to check each of the hills in the remote area. And in the foothills of the Rocky Desert, about 7 miles from Las Vegas, detectives discovered an old worn tent apparently belonging to Stevens and several important pieces of evidence. Under one of the bushes near the camp lay pants stained with blood. As forensics later determined, it was Shona Tiaffey's blood. Inside the tent, investigators also found a price tag with a barcode from a hammer purchased at one of the supermarkets on the eve of the crime. Back at headquarters, police told Neil Stevens what they had discovered. Then detectives used an old trick to pull more information from him. They told the detainee that someone was clearly trying to frame him. Stevens, in turn, also stunned the detectives. Instead of denying guilt, he confessed that he was indeed the one who attacked Shona Tiaffey, although Big Will himself wasn't sure of the identity of Stevens's victim, but it turned out the man had hit the mark. Stevens explained in detail what he had done to the woman. The only thing detectives didn't understand was his motive, why he attacked Shona specifically, and Stevens himself wasn't quick to inform them. The explanation for his misconduct was found when police checked Stevens' mobile phone. Among other contacts in the lists was the name George. Detectives asked Stevens who George was, and he replied that it was his friend, the firefighter. George turned out to be that same George, Shona's husband, and Neil Stevens was that homeless man whom George had hired for odd jobs around the house and garden and who had caused additional arguments between the spouses. George's number appeared repeatedly in the call log, causing many pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. Soon, during the investigation, detectives discovered dozens of phone calls between Stevens and George. These two men had called each other 87 times in the last month, preceding the murder of poor Shona. George and Stevens had met several years earlier when they both lived on the same street. Stevens at the time lived in his sister's house, and George in the house next door. One needed money, the other wanted to antagonize his own wife, so they struck a mutually beneficial agreement. The homeless man sometimes did some household chores, while irritating Shona with his presence. Even after Stevens left his sister's house and became homeless, George tried to keep him close. Many people believe that even then he was plotting his wife's murder, therefore specifically finding reasons to manipulate Stevens, preparing, so to speak, the ground for the future crime. The relationship between the men was quite complicated. The investigator suspected that Stevens suffered from mental illness, and George used this to his advantage. He very skillfully manipulated the vagrant, who literally hung on his every word. As Stevens confessed, he idolized George, considering him his closest friend, and was ready to do anything for him. Then, detectives examined the hammer tag and found out it was sold at a nearby major retail store. This led investigators on a tedious mission, reviewing hundreds of hours of surveillance camera footage. Finally, they caught a break when they noticed George Tiaffey and Neil Stevens in the footage, together buying the tool, ski mask, and black clothes. The recording clearly showed the faces of these two men, cheerfully pushing a shopping cart with their purchases. Meanwhile, Stevens continued sharing his story with investigators. Its essence was that George paid him $600 to kill his own wife, Shona, promising several thousand more after he received money from her life insurance policy. Stevens even revealed that he and George had discussed several other ideas about how best to end Shona's life, and ultimately concluded that home invasion would be the best option. The small burglary that occurred 3 weeks prior was a sort of trial run, aimed at letting Stevens easily navigate the woman's house if something went wrong. George even allowed him to steal his wife's wedding ring to pawn it and get cash as a bonus. Then the arrestee agreed to show police where he had buried the murder weapon, the hammer broken into 2 pieces that he had used to strike Shona's head during the brutal attack. The tool still had traces of dried blood. Stevens recalled how the woman kept asking him why he was doing this, and Stevens continued silently delivering blow after blow until the hammer broke and Shona fell dead. In the end, everything that arrested Neil Stevens told detectives was more than enough to arrest George Tiaffey as an accomplice, instead of going to detain the firefighter on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. Investigators for some reason called his mother and sister and informed them that George was involved in the crime against Shona. The relatives didn't believe the police and were adamant that this was some horrible mistake. They were firmly convinced that George was incapable of betraying a loved one, and moreover, he couldn't take the life of the woman who had given him a beautiful daughter. Of course, they can be understood if you were told something shocking about a family member, that they had committed a serious crime. You would likely also think it wasn't true. Mom and sister couldn't even imagine that their George had hired someone to coldly dispose of Shona. The investigators' strange decision to call the suspect's mother and sister before making the arrest nearly became a fatal mistake. This happened on the 9th day after Shona's tragic death, and as soon as the relatives learned the bitter truth, they immediately rushed to dial George's number. And a few minutes after this conversation, police officers who were keeping George Tiaffey under surveillance and monitoring his phone calls heard his sister call and tell him that he was now considered guilty in his wife's death. After this, George jumped out of the house, leaped into his truck, and sped onto the highway. Probably this news came as a shock to him. Before, he thought he would get away with everything. George Tiaffey chaotically weaved through city traffic and drove onto Summerlin Parkway. He accelerated to 85 miles per hour and crashed into a barrier. Police believed it was a suicide attempt because there were no skid marks on the road. The man deliberately directed his vehicle into a concrete barrier. Surprisingly, George survived the car accident because, according to emergency responders, he was wearing his seatbelt. He was urgently taken to a local hospital, where detectives later arrested him. When George was informed of the reason for his detention, that is, accused of taking Shona Tiaffey's life, he simply looked up from his hospital bed and said, "Okay." Meanwhile, at the police station, Neil Stevens was also charged. All this came as a shock to Shona's family, but also brought relief. If George Tiaffey's suicide attempt had succeeded and he had escaped retribution, his sudden death would surely have angered Shona's family. But this didn't happen. The time frame in which the criminals responsible for the woman's death were arrested was remarkable. This time it took police just 9 days to track them down and bring them to justice. Unfortunately, this won't bring Shona back to her daughter, family, and friends, but at least it was the first step toward justice. The loved ones knew that the fight was still far from over. 3 months after the arrest, Neil Stevens pleaded guilty to taking Shona Tiaffey's life, with the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty, on the condition that he would have to testify against George. The problem was only that Stevens was still very attached to George and doubted he could play against him. But this person was actually quite suggestible, so the lawyers were able to convince him to act as a prosecution witness, since Tiaffey continued to claim he had nothing to do with Shona's death. In August 2015, at the court hearing, Neil did everything possible to explain to the jury what had happened. In doing so, He accused George as the main inspiration behind the crime. It was George who asked him to eliminate his wife, paid him $600, gave him the key to the apartment. It was he who had reasons to want Shona's death. Money was the main motive for the crime. While the Tiaffey family lived in comfort, everything was fine. But after the financial crisis, George became obsessed with hoarding, while Shona tried to live in the moment and spend money on what was necessary. George Tiaffey was a man who had achieved numerous successes in his life. When his marriage began to crumble, he could no longer change anything. The idea that he would ultimately not have complete control over his daughter and wife forced him to carry out his cunning plan. Despite Stevens's attempt to testify against George, George's lawyer stated that Stevens's story was interesting and entertaining in its own way. But could one believe a person who had already broken the law multiple times? Where was the evidence that his client participated in the conspiracy? The defense team questioned Stevens' entire account. During cross-examination, Stevens admitted that he had experienced visual hallucinations and heard voices in his head. The witness also didn't deny excessive use of alcohol and prohibited substances. All these things combined made his testimony less authoritative. Such a witness didn't inspire confidence. Big Will also testified for the prosecution, but during cross-examination admitted that Stevens wasn't someone whose words could be trusted. It seemed the prosecution's case was falling apart before their eyes. Shona's relatives and loved ones feared that the jury might find George Tiaffey not guilty due to lack of evidence. And for the jury, this was indeed a difficult choice. On one side, a defendant with perfect references from everywhere, from work, school, college, and neighbors. On the other side, a witness, a person who had repeatedly broken the law, suffered from harmful addiction, and wasn't entirely mentally healthy. The prosecution's main task was to convince the jury that the seemingly perfect George Tiaffey was capable of a brutal crime, and the prosecution had much more evidence than just the words of a questionable witness. The prosecutors presented some of the most incriminating evidence. These were footage showing George and Stevens buying hammers, a ski mask, and other items intended for committing the crime. This was done just 5 days before the attack on Shona. The prosecutor also drew attention to the fact that in the last month preceding the murder, Stevens and George called each other much more frequently than at other times. 87 calls in a month, and 5 of them the evening before, just before Stevens was supposed to be lying in wait for the woman in her apartment. George's lawyer tried, of course, to argue that this proved nothing, and that all the items bought by the accomplices at the store were intended only for household work. George himself didn't testify. He calmly watched the proceedings without showing any emotion. After a week-long trial, having heard about 40 witnesses and with 400 pieces of physical evidence, 12 jurors went to decide George Tiaffey's fate. 3 years had passed since Shona was found brutally beaten, and her family hoped their long, agonizing wait would end in justice prevailing. On one side of the courtroom sat Shona's family. Some were dressed in pink, her favorite color. On the other side were George's supporters, fully convinced that he wasn't involved in the murder of his own wife. Finally, after 3 long days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They were able to see the rotten core behind George Tiaffey's perfect image. He was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, the defendant stood silently with the same impassive look he had maintained throughout the trial. He seemed to feel no remorse or sympathy for the victim. Although Shona's family rejoiced that justice had prevailed, not everyone was satisfied with this result. George's family, friends, and colleagues still believe in his innocence. Neil Stevens, who physically carried out George's plan, was also sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 42 years behind bars. In 2017, George tried to appeal his sentence. In the appeal, he complained about his lawyer's incompetence and insisted that during several months preceding the murder, he was in an altered mental state and experienced distorted thoughts and delusions. Due to pills, he thought he had to save his daughter by ridding her of a bad mother. Fortunately, George's appeal was unsuccessful, and the man who continues to spread slander even after his wife's death is forced to spend the rest of his days behind bars. The mysterious disappearance of Maria Carlson in October 2011 raised numerous questions for everyone. It seemed that she had simply vanished into thin air, though in reality she was very close by, but deep underground. When a married couple faces infertility, their desire to have their own child becomes even stronger. Sometimes it turns into an obsession. The husband and wife are willing to go to great lengths to fill their family home with a child's laughter. One solution to this problem is surrogacy. However, this way out of the situation doesn't always unfold as the prospective parents planned. Sometimes during the 9 months of pregnancy, the surrogate mother becomes so attached to the baby that she can no longer part with it. That's when all agreements become meaningless. In today's story, we'll discover what childless parents were prepared to do to have their own little one. Marie Jane Carlson was born on October 7, 1974, in the Philippines, to single mother Nina Ackeson. Marie spent her childhood alongside her mom. The girl never knew her father and had no idea where he was. When Marie grew older, Nina decided to send her to America so her daughter would have a chance at getting a good education. A friend of Nina's, an American serviceman, took guardianship of the teenager, bringing Marie to the United States and raising her with his other children. The girl lived in a family where she had 6 more brothers and sisters. Marie almost immediately developed a mutual affection and close bond with Esta, one of her guardian's daughters. Deep down, the peers always considered themselves sisters. Sometimes a friend can become closer than a blood sister, but this wasn't the case with Marie, because she and Esta actually turned out to be half-sisters. After the girl had lived with her American family for some time, her guardian revealed that he was actually Marie's biological father. For some unknown reason, he had kept this from her for several years. However, this news now made Marie the happiest person on earth. The wonderful discovery that she and Esta were real sisters brought them even closer together. When Marie turned 18, she had a serious falling out with her stepmother and left home. As a result, she was taken in by a woman named Alice Barber, who essentially became her second mother. The woman had enough emotional strength and love to help Marie overcome certain mental health challenges. As she grew older, the young woman and her sister moved into an apartment located above a karaoke bar. This wasn't by chance. Marie loved singing karaoke. She and Esta were regulars at this establishment and often spent entire nights performing songs. This became their favorite memory of their youth. Esta said that her sister was naturally magnetic, and people were drawn to her. Marie wasn't just full of life, she was life itself. This young woman always noticed beauty in other people. And to lift the spirits of those around her, she wasn't shy about giving out compliments left and right. Marie adored the color pink, and had loads of clothing in pink shades, which further emphasized her pure energy and charm. One of the people captivated by Marie's magnetic attraction was Jeff Carlson. He showed signs of interest and managed to attract the 20-year-old girl with his serious intentions. Very soon, Marie and Jeff fell in love and got married. They had a wonderful daughter, whom they named Paris. Marie studied at college to earn a degree in criminal justice. After completing her studies, she got a job at the police department and quickly climbed the career ladder, becoming a deputy sheriff in Colorado. Carlson dreamed of becoming an FBI agent in the future. However, not everything in the young woman's life was as smooth as it seemed at first glance. Marie struggled with mental health issues throughout her life. This interfered not only with her career building, but also with relationships. Eventually, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. On one hand, she got answers to her questions, everything started to make sense. On the other hand, Marie had to learn to live with this, somehow adapt, study the illness, and reduce triggering factors. Maintaining stability during this period was not easy. And no matter how hard Marie tried, her mental health faltered and affected those around her. It was because of her illness that the young woman lost her police job, and ultimately, this led to the dissolution of her marriage with Jeff. The spouses parted on a positive note, and the man continued to support his former wife. They simply came to a mutual decision that they weren't right for each other, but for their daughter's sake, they needed to maintain a good relationship. There was no bitterness between Jeff and Marie. They understood that each would now have their own life, but their shared daughter would forever remain the connecting link between them. For some time, Paris was under Marie's custody, but then the woman realized that Jeff could provide their daughter with the stability the child needed. Marie made one of the most difficult decisions in her life. She had to think everything through seriously and choose not what she wanted, but what was best for her daughter. Jeff was an excellent father, and Marie's mental health issues could sooner or later affect Paris. And the woman dreamed that her girl would grow up in a stable environment. Unfortunately, she herself couldn't provide this for her daughter. Marie had a habit of leaving somewhere for several days without telling anyone. Nevertheless, this didn't mean that Marie disappeared from Paris's life. Mother and daughter stayed in constant contact, talked on the phone every day, and Marie visited the girl as often as she could. At the same time, she did everything possible to improve her mental state. Doctors advised the woman to change her environment, and Marie moved to Fort Walton Beach in Florida on the Emerald Coast. The beautiful area and sea air helped restore her emotional strength, so the move there proved very beneficial for her mental health. Marie got a job at a coffee shop located near the local church. Thanks to this, the woman began directly participating in church life and met the people who ran it. The Calvary Church on the Emerald Coast was led by local pastor James Flanders, a charismatic guy with a big heart, known for his rare but inspiring sermons. The parishioners loved him, and to attract more people to the church, James began publishing videos of his sermons on YouTube. He had long dreamed of creating a large community and was happy to share his thoughts with future congregation members. James wasn't the only person with a big heart. His wife Tanya led the female congregation and had a reputation as a woman who benefited her community through good deeds. Therefore, when Marie began participating in church life, the Flanders couple showed her unprecedented generosity. Knowing that Marie had recently moved, they helped pay some of her bills. That's how it all began. In October 2009, Marie essentially moved into their Fort Walton Beach home, becoming part of the Flanders family. This was, in essence, the third family to take her in the United States. The first people to take custody of little Marie was her biological father's American family. The second was a woman named Alice Barber, whom everyone called Kay. She cared for Marie when she turned 18. Eventually, Kay became an extremely important person in Marie's life. The girl believed this was how a mother should be, and now Marie called Kay and told her she had found spiritual refuge in the church and befriended the local pastor. A bit later, Alice Barber would play a significant role in this story and help police investigate her ward's disappearance. So, Marie moved into Pastor James and his wife Tanya's home, and rather complicated and contradictory relationships developed between the three of them. In 2010, the young woman went to Arizona and lived with James's family for some time. Then she returned to Fort Walton Beach, and it turned out that Marie was pregnant. The church congregation was told that in Arizona, Marie had been dating a man who turned out to be very rough and cruel. Upon learning she was expecting a child, she broke things off with him and returned to Florida. According to this version, Marie wanted to terminate the pregnancy, but James and Tanya, being kind people, intervened and agreed to adopt the child. However, the Flanders' close friends and relatives heard quite a different story, which they swore to keep secret. In reality, Marie was acting as a surrogate mother. James and Tanya had long struggled with infertility. The woman would get pregnant but could never carry a baby to term. She had already experienced several miscarriages. Because of this, they couldn't have children, but desperately dreamed of a baby. Marie was so kind as to agree to help them in this situation. In private circles, Tanya assured that Marie became pregnant through artificial insemination, but since IVF is quite an expensive procedure, they decided to save money and did everything the old-fashioned way to facilitate conception. Tanya said she was quite comfortable with this arrangement. The couple agreed with Marie that after the baby's birth, she would stay with them for the first 3 months to feed the infant. But after this period, the surrogate mother was to leave the Flanders home forever, and Marie would essentially gift them this child for everything they had done for her. However, neither version was entirely accurate. The only thing that proved true was that Marie was indeed pregnant, and James was the father. The pastor and his wife simply didn't want to advertise their complicated relationship to other parishioners. They knew James would be condemned for having relations with another woman, so they tried to give the story a more decent tone. Whatever the case, everyone got the impression that this was a mutually agreed-upon situation where everyone was satisfied. Marie was happy to give the baby to the couple who had welcomed her with open arms and who themselves were unable to have children, and James and Tanya were immensely happy to finally become parents. Everything turned out wonderfully right up until 3 months after the baby's birth. Baby Grace was born in July 2011. As expected, all residents of the Flanders household cared for the girl. James, Tanya, and Marie decided that Grace would be breastfed until 3 months, so by fall, the woman began gradually transitioning the child to formula. Everything was going according to plan. Then suddenly, on October 19, 2011, several of Marie's relatives and friends received a rather strange message from her. Marie wrote that she had left Fort Walton Beach the day before, and now was the best time to carry out her long-held plan. She had hidden this from everyone, knowing that her loved ones would try to talk her out of it. At the end of the message, Marie said she loved and valued everyone. The strange message was sent to several recipients, including her ex-husband Jeff, sister Esther, Alice Barber, as well as James, Tanya, and a couple of Marie's friends. And without exception, all of her closest people immediately had a bad feeling about this. The thing is, this wasn't like Marie at all. She would never leave without seeing her 7-year-old daughter Paris, and wouldn't send a message instead of calling to explain everything, and would have told at least one person about her plans. Some immediately tried calling Marie back, others wrote reply messages, but neither group received any further clarification. Alice Barber, who had become a mother figure to the girl, asked Marie about her 3-month-old daughter Grace, and Marie replied that the child was in good hands with Tanya and James. This was the only response Marie sent, and it indeed confirmed Alice's concerns, because in all the years Marie had known the Flanders, when talking about them, she always said James and Tanya, not the other way around. Though from the outside this might have seemed insignificant, for Alice such a switch was an alarming signal. The woman knew Marie well and had heard her say James and Tanya hundreds of times. This phrase was practically imprinted in her head. Alice had an agonizing feeling that someone else had written the message. She contacted the Flanders directly and asked if everything was all right with Marie. Their response didn't reassure her, but only added to her worries. Tanya said that Marie had actually left their home 2 days earlier, and before this, her mental state had been concerning. Sister Esther and ex-husband Jeff Carlson were also troubled by the strange message and Marie's subsequent silence. They began calling other relatives and friends hoping to learn some details, but no one knew anything. Jeff, knowing how devoted his ex-wife was to their 7-year-old daughter Paris, concluded that Marie must be in trouble. The man decided to report her missing to the police, but this happened almost a week after Marie's disappearance, on October 24th. Although Marie was a grown 37-year-old woman, and had the right to go wherever she wanted, the police took her ex-husband's report seriously this time. The authorities immediately opened a missing person case. Jeff was honest with the detectives and explained that Marie could have previously gone somewhere for several days, but she always called beforehand and visited her daughter Paris, and especially never ignored calls from loved ones like now, knowing they might call her about something important. The immediate actions taken by the police pleased Marie's relatives. Usually, as soon as officers heard about someone with a mental illness, they were reluctant to search. One of the investigators was a woman who had also recently had a baby, and she perfectly understood that rarely would any mother leave her newborn daughter and simply leave. This inconsistency became the decisive factor for this detective that Marie Carlson had gotten into some trouble and urgently needed help. Investigating this case became her top priority. First, the detective spoke with Marie Carlson's close ones and friends. Esta told them about her sister's divorce from Jeff, how she lost her job, and how she had to live with James and Tanya in Florida. The investigators also learned about Marie's interesting relationship with the Flanders. Esta knew little about the pregnancy and child's birth because Marie hardly talked about this topic, and her sister didn't want to ask questions and interfere in matters that weren't her business. The woman hoped that Marie would tell her about it herself when she was ready. At that time, the investigators still didn't know who the child's father was, and they wanted to figure this out first. In the earliest stage of the search, the detectives decided to pay a visit to the Flanders. The couple were the last to see Marie and could know more than others. At least they were able to clarify certain points. On October 27th, James made his only statement to authorities. He told about how Marie entered their lives and gave an explanation about her pregnancy. According to James, discussions between the three of them led to Marie agreeing to become a surrogate mother. Due to lack of funds for IVF, they decided that James would simply sleep with Marie, and Tanya didn't object. She had dreamed of having her own baby for so long that she agreed to everything. While Marie was living with his family in Arizona, the couple visited her. That's where it all happened. The man claimed this was the only time he essentially cheated on his wife, and that was for a noble cause. Marie got pregnant on the first try. As soon as this was confirmed, the Flanders brought her back to their home in Florida. Tanya was very worried that Marie might suddenly change her mind and decide to terminate the pregnancy. James and his wife knew about the bipolar disorder and saw that Marie's mood could change at any moment. That's exactly why they wanted to be near her and their future child. Marie sometimes got nervous, but overall the pregnancy progressed normally. The couple cared for her and tried to anticipate any wishes to keep her mental state stable. In summer, when baby Grace was born, they threw a party at the Flanders house. James showed photos from the celebration where everyone, including Marie, was smiling and happy. But then, everything changed. The couple began noticing how after the child's birth, Marie's behavior started to change. Due to the pregnancy, the woman had stopped taking her prescribed medications and now fell into a depressive state. It seemed to the officers that James was hinting that Marie might harm herself, or at least was planning to do so. He was so concerned that he worried about her well-being. And ultimately, on October 17th, he stayed home and didn't go to work to monitor Marie's condition. James also mentioned that this was the last time he and his wife saw the woman who had given them baby Grace. And a couple of days later, on October 19th, Marie's close ones, friends, and family received a strange text message from her. That morning, Marie woke up in a bad mood. For some reason, the man worried she might leave and try to take the baby with her. Something was clearly wrong with her. Later that day, Marie said she was tired and went to her room to take a nap. At this time, Tanya went shopping with the baby, and James first waited for the woman to wake up, after which, around 6 in the evening, he went for a run. When he returned home, Marie was already gone. However, in the room, he and Tanya found a packed bag with belongings, which for some reason the woman hadn't taken with her. On the 19th, 2 days later, the couple received a strange message from Marie, which was sent to several other people besides them. The Flanders waited a couple of days hoping the woman would return, and then decided to go look for her themselves. And although they didn't find Marie, they did find her car. The Mazda was parked in a paid lot at the nearest airport. James didn't want Marie to overpay for extended parking and drove the vehicle to his house. It never occurred to the pastor to report the woman missing. After this, James gave the detectives the receipt from the paid parking lot, which confirmed that he had indeed picked up the white Mazda on October 21st, 2011, from the airport parking lot. Moreover, police received information that Marie's car had been left there on the 18th. This was strange, considering she was last seen on the 17th. So where was she after leaving the pastor's house? The authorities were skeptical about Marie's sudden departure because her belongings were still at home, and there was no activity on her bank accounts. Police checked passenger lists for flights, and Marie Carlson's name wasn't there. There were also no records of her purchasing a ticket. This meant one of two things. Either the woman herself left the car in the parking lot to throw people off track, or someone else did it for the same reason. Naturally, the police's next step was to check the surveillance cameras in the parking lot. Detectives wanted to know who was driving the Mazda, but as usually happens in such situations, the cameras weren't working that day. In the end, experts tried to lift a fingerprint from the button that must be pressed to get a parking ticket. But unfortunately, this didn't work, and detectives were back at the beginning of their investigation. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Questions about where Marie was, how her car ended up in the parking lot, and whether she was all right still remained unanswered. Investigators began questioning other church members, hoping to get an idea of what might have happened, but only learned various versions about Marie's pregnancy and relationships between her, Tanya, and James, ranging from the abusive boyfriend in Arizona to the planned surrogacy situation. The investigators only became more confused, so they tried to talk to the Flanders again to clarify some things. This time they spoke with Tanya, and the woman confirmed what James had said earlier, but added some details. Before going to bed, James and Marie had a few drinks. Tanya was in the room with them during the sexual act. It turned out that Marie wasn't just a surrogate mother. She was in a polygamous relationship with the Flanders couple. It seemed this information was kept secret from everyone, as such behavior didn't align with what the pastor and his wife preached in church. According to Tanya, Marie was happy to help them have a child and fully followed their agreement. But when baby Grace was born, everything changed. Marie became withdrawn and wanted the daughter for herself. By the way, a woman from the church told detectives about this. Once she heard Marie declare that she wanted Grace and James to belong to her alone. And another parishioner mentioned something very strange and frightening. Once Tanya said that James would never be able to take Marie's life, but she herself would have the courage to do it. At that moment, the police's attention completely shifted to the Flanders couple. They definitely had a motive to get rid of the child's surrogate mother, whom they considered their own. However, suspicion alone wasn't enough in the investigation. They needed more substantial evidence, for example, a body. Through 2 months of unsuccessful searching for the missing Marie Carlson, the investigation accumulated a lot of information regarding the mobile phone records of Marie, James, and Tanya. Detectives discovered that wherever Marie's phone was in the days after her disappearance, James's phone was pinged by the same cell towers. This meant their phones were close together, despite James saying he last saw Marie on the 17th. On October 18th, when Marie's car was driven to the airport parking lot, James's phone responded to the airport's cell tower just minutes afterward, and on October 19th, Both their mobiles disconnected from the same cell tower near the Flanders house when Marie allegedly sent the message to all her close friends and family. James's entire story started to look implausible. Then another detail emerged. Detectives came across a highway patrol inquiry when they were checking the license plate of a white Mazda abandoned at a gas station on October 17th. The patrol officer looked up the plates and saw the car was registered to Marie Carlson. At that time, the woman hadn't yet been reported missing, so the officer who noticed the car didn't take any action. But now that Marie was missing, this became an important lead because James's phone was pinged near the same gas station. Once detectives learned about this, they hypothesized that James might have taken Marie Carlson's life, then tried to dispose of her car. Leaving it at the gas station, he apparently hoped the vehicle would be stolen. But since this didn't happen, the next day he moved it to the airport's paid parking lot to create the impression that the woman had left of her own accord. All these suspicions were based on mobile phone records. The data confirmed that Tanya Flanders was indeed shopping with her newborn daughter on the 17th and wasn't near Marie and James, so it was unlikely the spouses acted together. Despite how incriminating the information seemed, this definitely wasn't enough to accuse someone of a serious crime. Therefore, detectives decided to talk to James again regarding the new facts. They called the pastor and arranged a meeting with him. However, there was no one to talk to, as on January 28, 2012, James, Tanya, and baby Grace hurriedly packed their belongings and left for Arizona in the middle of the night. This happened immediately after the investigators' call. The sudden relocation aroused even more suspicions. Additionally, another church pastor named Jason Anderson informed investigators that prior to departure, James had spoken about his intention to leave the country. The abrupt desire to hide from law enforcement was an alarming signal. But even more shocking to the detectives was the information that the fleeing James had hinted at voluntary departure from life. Because of this, he was even placed in a psychiatric hospital for 10 days. All this happened several days after police officers knocked on the Flanders' door and inquired about Marie. Pastor Jason Anderson also revealed that before their departure, James and Tanya held a meeting at the church, where they admitted to being in a polygamous relationship with Marie Carlson, and this woman meant more to them than just a surrogate mother. However, before Marie disappeared, she and James had a severe argument. He even had several scratches from her nails. But the Flanders were certain that Marie was alive. After such a candid confession, the man stepped down from his position as pastor, and a few days later left Fort Walton Beach with his wife and daughter. Fortunately, before this, Alice Barber, Marie's substitute mother, managed to approach the couple with a request to collect Carlson's belongings, among which was a laptop. The woman immediately handed it over to law enforcement. The device was sent to the forensic laboratory, but no information was found on it. Everything had been erased. The suspects in Marie Carlson's disappearance had left. Her body wasn't found. All evidence proved useless. The case reached a temporary deadlock. However, not all hope was lost, because in April 2012, anonymous information was received by the police. A person who wished to remain unnamed reported that Marie was no longer alive and James Flanders was responsible, having buried her body in the backyard of his house. This information gave detectives reason to conduct a thorough search of the area behind the former pastor's home. Dogs and ground-penetrating radar were utilized, but despite hours of searching, nothing was discovered. The newly emerged hope in the hearts of Marie's relatives was once again shattered. The case stalled again for some time. A whole year passed before James Flanders answered the detective's call. The conversation lasted about 2 hours. The man complained that he had become a victim. He was going to be accused of something he hadn't done. The pastor's mental health sharply deteriorated after the situation with Marie's disappearance. To the detective's direct question about who took Marie's life, James answered that he had nothing to do with it. Unfortunately, without a body and confession, Police could do little, but they didn't give up and took a wait-and-see position. 3 years later, forensic technologies had significantly improved. Marie's laptop was sent for a repeated examination, and specialists managed to recover deleted information from the computer. It turned out that Marie and James's relationship was far more intimate, and they weren't limited to a single sexual encounter. The man and woman exchanged rather private messages. There were more than 100 of them, and they all ceased on October 17th, the day Marie vanished. Also on that day, all activity on her credit card and bank account completely stopped. An indirect piece of evidence was also James's sermon, uploaded by him to YouTube. It was published approximately a month before Marie's disappearance. The pastor spoke bizarre things. He talked about wanting to strangle to death anyone who would stab him in the back. James seemed to warn that if someone were to gossip about him, trying to break him or hurt his feelings, he would commit a sin and send the liar to the afterlife. The pastor's words sounded menacing. Such utterances were hardly acceptable within church walls. Technically, this video wasn't yet proof of a planned crime, but it again cast a shadow on James Flanders, and the detectives considered that there were enough circumstantial pieces of evidence in this case to ask a judge to issue an arrest warrant for the pastor. On May 5, 2015, James was arrested and charged with second-degree homicide. If the prosecution had rushed and submitted the case materials to court, the defense attorneys would have easily torn all the evidence to shreds, and James would have been acquitted. And this would have been unfair not only to Marie, but also to her loved ones. Fortunately, the prosecution team acted wisely. The prosecutor offered James a plea deal in exchange for revealing the location of missing Marie's body and the story of what happened to her. The deal promised the pastor a more lenient sentence. This wasn't exactly what Marie and her family deserved, but at least they would finally be able to properly lay her remains to rest and get some closure. In April 2016, James agreed to the deal and pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which carried a maximum sentence of only 15 years. James told investigators that lately, Marie had been unhappy with how the couple was raising her daughter. They began having constant arguments about this. Moreover, the woman had stopped taking the pills prescribed by her doctor. Because of this, her mental state was very unstable. She would become agitated over any issue and turn aggressive. On October 17th, Marie literally attacked him because he had complained about her depressive state and mentioned hospitalization. Marie became enraged and began to assault him. In an attempt to stop Marie, James embraced her in a tight bear hug, and they both fell to the ground. When he realized the woman was no longer resisting, he released his grip. Marie wasn't moving or breathing. She was dead. Instead of calling 911, as any rational person would have done, especially if it wasn't premeditated, James wrapped her body in a blanket and buried it in his backyard. He dug such a deep hole that neither ground-penetrating radar nor search dogs could detect the body when searching the area. And in 2013, the couple filed a petition to terminate Marie Carlson's parental rights to Grace. If detectives had thoroughly examined the house's backyard, they could have found missing Marie's body within 6 months after her disappearance, and then James would have received a full sentence for concealing the body and taking Marie's life. Because of this, the detectives working on the case experienced feelings of guilt and frustration. In any case, the possibility of bringing Marie home was very important to her family, and they were glad they could finally lay her to rest in peace. The forensics team, guided by James, excavated the hole in the backyard and retrieved the deceased woman's remains to return to her relatives. At this moment, James fell to his knees and began crying over the spot where he had buried Marie. This was so theatrical, foolish, and simply offensive to everyone present. To live peacefully, knowing you had taken someone's life, and then to put on an act, pretending to be distressed over your victim's death. In July 2016, James was sentenced to 15 years in prison. James was around 47 at the time. In court, he claimed he never thought he could fall so low. To this day, he is still serving his sentence. His release is scheduled for 2029. As for Tanya Flanders, no evidence was found that she was somehow involved in the killing of Marie Carlson. Did she know what her husband had done? She surely knew and remained silent, wanting to preserve the family, although Tanya herself never mentioned this. The woman still raises Marie's child, daughter Grace. James's family helps her with this. Marie's sister, Esther, very much wanted to gain custody of her niece and filed a petition, but the girl remains with Tanya. One day, a handsome young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow, located in the historic site of Port Arthur. His long blonde hair framed his lean face. The guy surveyed the room where several patrons were seated, then decided to go up to the second floor and settle on the balcony. He ordered a mountain of food. His appetite was heightened because he already anticipated what he would do after the abundant meal. The peculiar guest of the establishment unhurriedly emptied his plates, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and picked up the gym bag that was sitting under the table. After that, he went downstairs, found an empty table in the corner, and headed toward it. He carefully pulled out a video camera from the bag and positioned it so that most of the dining room was in view. The preparations were complete, time to begin. And the young man took out a rifle. This was 28-year-old Martin Bryant, a resident of Australia, who wanted the whole country to know about him. Martin John Bryant was born in Tasmania, Australia, on May 7, 1967. He was the firstborn to his parents, Carlene and Morris Bryant. Later, Martin got a younger sister, Lindy. The boy's childhood was quite typical, but he himself could not be called typical at all, because from an early age this child was very different from others. He wasn't like everyone else. He seemed to enjoy teasing and irritating those around him, doing things that got on everyone's nerves. Martin was so bothersome that even his parents grew weary of interacting with him. When left alone, the boy would start breaking and destroying everything within his reach. At some point, his mother noticed that her son would seemingly drop out of reality, become detached and emotionless, and then suddenly return to his usual state and start pestering his younger sister. At school, Martin was extremely destructive, aggressive, and cruel, not only in his interactions with other students, but also with teachers. His parents knew their son irritated anyone who encountered him, but they couldn't do anything about it, attributing it to personality traits. At age 10, Martin was expelled from elementary school for his aggressive behavior. During a consultation with a psychologist, the boy stated that one of his entertainments was torturing animals. This greatly concerned the specialist, who advised the parents to pay special attention to their son's strange tendencies, because cruelty to animals was a troubling sign. His parents directed all their efforts toward ensuring their child would grow up to be a normal person. A year later, Martin returned to school, and although his behavior improved somewhat, he still didn't miss chances to tease younger children. He performed poorly in his studies, learning came with difficulty, so his transfer to a special education group at Newtown High School was a natural outcome. However, even there, no progress was noted. Problems with studies and behavior only continued to worsen. After struggling through several years, Martin dropped out of school. During this period, he became even more withdrawn and spent most of his time alone. Martin had absolutely no friends and rarely left home. Understanding something wasn't right with their son, his parents took him for a psychiatric consultation. The doctor examined the teenager, conducted a series of tests, and drew discouraging conclusions. In the intelligence test, Martin scored only 66 points. This was considered mental impairment. Particularly low scores were in verbal and nonverbal reasoning, as well as cognitive functions that help a person rationally understand and analyze the surrounding world, adapt to its conditions, and interact with others. Martin's mental development corresponded to that of an 11-year-old child. The psychiatrist also diagnosed Martin with autism and Asperger's syndrome. In his conclusion, the doctor noted that Martin could neither read nor write. He emphasized the importance of efforts made by his parents to prevent further deterioration of the situation. Because if they didn't intervene, didn't dedicate more time to raising and developing their son as a full-fledged member of society, he would undoubtedly face a dark future. Based on the examination results, the young man received disability benefits. His mother and father truly tried to do everything possible to ensure Martin would grow up to be a normal person. Eventually, he even developed a hobby that he tried to cultivate, and he succeeded quite well at it. The young man enjoyed working in the garden, tending to plants, mowing lawns, and he even managed to earn money doing this. In 1987, when he was 19, Martin met 54-year-old Helen Harvey, an heiress to a share in the lottery business. The woman owned a huge old mansion where she lived with her elderly mother. Helen took such a liking to the young gardener that she decided to support him and offered him to landscape her vast property. Judging by the appearance of the grounds, no one had maintained it for a long time. The entire land was overgrown with weeds, shrub branches had turned into impenetrable jungle, and some trees had simply withered. Martin had a large scope of work ahead, so the young man spent all his free time at Helen Harvey's mansion, tending to the plants. The lady of the house and the young gardener became friends. The woman often invited the youth for lunch, engaged in deep conversations with him, and shared stories about her life. Everything seemed wonderful until one day, a strange and somewhat unexpected event occurred. The health department received an anonymous call reporting the dire situation of the mansion's residents. The caller revealed that 14 dogs and more than 40 cats were living in the building with the owner and her elderly mother. They were breeding and multiplying, defecating everywhere, turning the house into an uninhabitable place. It turned out that the mansion's interior was in the same neglected state as its exterior. The health department verified the information and discovered that the unsanitary conditions in which the women lived were indeed negatively affecting their health. Both residents of the mansion were hospitalized. The sanitary inspection issued an order to immediately remove all animals. Additionally, Helen was strictly forbidden from keeping pets in the future. As any good friend would do, Martin offered to clean up the house while Helen and her mother were in the hospital. The young man assured the woman that she had nothing to worry about. He would do everything properly. His father Maurice helped put the premises in order. Together they removed piles of clutter accumulated by the owner, cleaned the walls, furniture, and windows, and eliminated traces of animal activity. Unfortunately, during her hospital stay, Helen's elderly mother tragically passed away at the age of 79. When the owner, crushed by the loss of her closest person, returned to her mansion, everything inside had changed. The huge house, once filled with living creatures, had become empty and uncomfortable. No one scurried underfoot anymore, scratched the walls, or woke her at night. Helen felt very lonely inside the empty building. For a while, she tried to accept and adapt to the silence, but fairly quickly realized she couldn't live alone. She needed some kind of company. Since her mother passed away in the hospital and Helen had no other relatives, the woman turned to her young friend Martin and suggested he move in with her at the mansion. To her surprise and delight, the young man immediately accepted the invitation and moved into the house. From that moment on, they became inseparable. Naturally, the relationship between Helen and Martin was purely platonic. They were simply good friends, brightening each other's mundane days. For the next 3 years, the mansion's owner and the gardener spent almost every day together. They would wake up closer to noon, get dressed, and go to a nice restaurant or cafe. They spent the remainder of their days wandering through shops and making various purchases. Occasionally, Helen and Martin would go on vacation, taking some cruise, and of course, all of this was at Helen's expense. The time came when Martin needed to undergo a follow-up examination for his disability benefits. The psychiatrist discovered some negative changes in the young man's behavior, and this worried him. The young man told the doctor that he had one unusual desire. He would like to shoot at living people. In his report, the psychiatrist wrote that Martin harbored aggression toward other members of society. The doctor concluded that at this point, it was unsafe to remove Martin from his parents' supervision, so living in the house with Helen wasn't the best idea right now. But the parents weren't convinced by the specialist's warnings. Their son felt quite comfortable in Helen's house. The owner had never complained about him, never accused him of aggressive behavior or anything similar. Martin's father and mother also supported his friendship with Helen because their son had no other friends. His peers didn't want to associate with him. Therefore, the Bryants decided that such a friendship couldn't cause any harm. Life in Harvey's mansion continued to follow its course. Helen was only troubled by the fact that she desperately wanted to keep animals, but legally couldn't have them in her house. The woman decided to rectify the situation by buying a new house. In 1991, she and Martin moved to a 72-acre farm called Torresville in the small town of Copping. Helen focused her attention on the farm among the animals. That's where she spent most of her time, recharging her energy. Meanwhile, Martin became fascinated with weapons. He acquired an air pistol, which he carried everywhere with him. Neighbors recalled that Martin often shot at tourists' cars when they stopped to buy apples at the highway stand. And late in the evening, the young man would wander around neighboring properties, shooting the pistol in the air to annoy local dogs and make them bark throughout the area. The childhood habit of tormenting people and provoking them manifested in his adult life as well. Although Martin didn't cause significant damage, he could very easily spoil people's mood. Martin was a very peculiar person, but he managed to lead a more or less stable life on the farm until October 20th, 1992, when he and Helen got into a car accident. Harvey was behind the wheel, Martin in the passenger seat, when suddenly their car veered into the opposite lane and collided with oncoming traffic. Both were severely injured. Martin was rushed to the hospital, where he remained for the next 7 months, recovering from serious neck and back injuries. Helen, unfortunately, wasn't as lucky and didn't survive the crash. All of Harvey's acquaintances and neighbors knew that the woman never drove faster than 40 miles per hour, because Martin had a bad habit of grabbing the steering wheel while moving and jerking it in different directions. The young man found it very amusing when Helen would panic in such moments, and he thought it was funny. They had previously been involved in 3 car accidents as a result of the young man's foolish and unsafe pranks. And now, when this information became known to the police officers, they wanted to talk with Martin. Unfortunately, Martin's interrogation yielded no results, and no arrest followed. The young man denied his involvement in the tragedy that occurred, so investigators backed off, considering the car crash an accident. Martin Bryant was named the sole beneficiary in Helen Harvey's will, as the woman had no close relatives after her mother's death, and the young man was her only friend. He inherited property worth over 550,000 Australian dollars in total. While the young man was recovering in his hospital bed, his father Maurice moved to Torresville to maintain order there. His parents understood that their son would instantly waste all the inheritance because Martin had only the vaguest understanding of financial matters. His mother, Carlson, filed for a guardianship order and received custody. Due to Martin's reduced intellectual capacity and his mental issues, it wasn't difficult at all to convince the court that this was a necessary measure, and Carlson Bryant received the ability to manage the newly acquired assets. After 7 long months in the hospital, Martin was finally discharged and returned to the Torresville farm, only to discover that all his money, including funds in the joint bank account between him and Helen, was now in his mother's name. And his father had established his own rules in the house and on the farm. On August 14, 1993, About 2 months after Martin returned from the hospital to the farmhouse, his father, Morris's friend, stopped by for a visit and found no one inside. What was strange, however, was that Morris's car was parked in the driveway, and a note saying, "Call the police," was attached to the front door of the house. The father's bewildered friend approached Morris's car and looked inside. He saw that cash bills were lying in plain sight in the cabin, and judging by their quantity, there were several $1,000s in cash. All of this was so strange that the man decided not to delay and immediately called the police. The arriving law enforcement officers searched the house and all the surrounding farm territory, but found no traces of Morris's presence. They also didn't find any leads indicating that something had happened to the man. The farm had 4 dams, and the police called in a team of divers to examine the bottom of the reservoirs. After 2 days of searching, Morris Bryant's body was found in the water at the dam located closest to the house. One of his own weights was tied around the man's neck. Detectives described his death as unnatural, and it was ultimately ruled a voluntary departure from life. After his father Martin's mysterious death, he inherited over $250,000 of his savings. He sold the farmhouse for $143,000 and moved back to the old mansion in Newtown, where he once lived with Helen. The young man himself also changed after his father's death. If previously he dressed very carelessly and most often wore white work overalls, now he completely changed his style. Martin's clothing became more eccentric. He often wore a gray linen suit, a cravat, lizard skin shoes, and a Panama hat, or a blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt. The young man carried a briefcase everywhere for added respectability. If previously Martin had been antisocial and had no friends except Helen Harvey and only irritated people with his presence, now he developed a thirst for social interaction. Martin deliberately changed his style to look fashionable and presentable, as if he had built a successful career and was now prospering. In childhood and adolescence, his peers considered him strange and avoided him or openly mocked him. Now he felt he needed to fill this void, that is, to gain recognition and earn respect. When meeting random people, Martin constantly bragged about his successful business. He hoped that this way he could interest his conversation partners, but it never went beyond brief, meaningless conversations. These acquaintances never developed into any relationships or friendships. People would just politely listen to him and go their way, secretly laughing at the eccentric young man. Then Martin became fond of one restaurant, where he would come in full dress. The establishment's staff were polite to him, but guests often made fun of the peculiar young man dressed like Austin Powers from the 60s, the hero of the namesake film. They mocked his awkwardness and unusual appearance. The restaurant owner recalled that he felt sorry for the young man because he clearly had no friends. For the next 2 years, between 93 and 95, Martin became increasingly withdrawn. When the situation worsened, he decided to use money from his inheritance to go traveling, hoping it would bring him joy like before when he wandered with Helen. Martin made 14 international solo trips, and each evoked mixed feelings in him. He hated the destinations, but adored the flights. This happened because other passengers were always seated next to him in the aircraft cabin. They couldn't simply get up and leave their seats, so they had to listen to Martin's chatter. And in those moments, the young man received the human interaction that he seemed to be lacking. The flight itself was an unforgettable vacation for him, not the place where he eventually landed. Unfortunately, these meaningless conversations couldn't satisfy what Martin wanted. Although the conversations brought more joy than money or things, they were too infrequent. By late 1995, Martin's loneliness reached its peak, and he attempted to take his own life. After the unsuccessful attempt, the young man started drinking heavily. When later asked why he had lost interest in life, what had been the cause, Martin responded that he simply felt people were against him. When he tried to be friendly toward them, they would just walk away. Martin drank daily, spending most of his time alone with his thoughts in the large, empty house. Sometimes he would go outside and try to start conversations with neighbors, but in most cases, they too avoided his company. Once Martin told a neighbor that one day he would do something and make everyone remember his name. Naturally, the neighbor paid no attention to the intoxicated owner of the mansion. However, from that very day, Martin truly began planning something that would make his name known throughout Australia. A married couple named David and Noeline Martin owned a guest house called Seascape. The Martins acquired the property that Bryant's father Morris had wanted to buy before them. At that time, the man simply didn't have enough money. While he was gathering the necessary sum, the mini-hotel was purchased by David and Noeline. Later, the man repeatedly complained to his son about missing the opportunity to improve the family's financial situation. And Martin blamed the couple who had acquired the property. He believed they intentionally wanted to harm his family. This directly led to his father taking his own life as a result of stress and distress over the lost opportunity. Martin thought this was the only cause of Morris's depression. The young man especially missed his father, with whom he had a very close emotional relationship. Besides Helen, Morris was the only person who loved the young man and accepted all his peculiarities. The man didn't avoid communicating with his son and never truly judged him for his misdeeds. Every morning, Martin would wake up, think about Morris and the married couple, the current owners of Seascape. For him, these people were directly connected to his father's sudden departure from life. And one day, Martin woke up and realized he was ready to execute his plan. It was April 28, 1996, a date that became a day of mourning for Australia. At 11:45 a.m., the young man entered the guest house called Seascape and found both owners inside. Besides them, no one else was in the hotel. Martin pulled out a gun and shot the couple several times. He didn't explain anything to them, just did what he thought was right. A moment later, Bryant heard a car pull into the yard, followed by doors slamming. He understood that he didn't need witnesses at this moment, so he composed himself, went outside, introduced himself as the owner's son, and said that the mini-hotel was temporarily closed, asking them to return later. After the tourists left, Martin found the front door keys, locked the guest house, and drove away. It all took him about an hour. Now, he was heading to his next destination. On the way, Martin noticed a young couple standing near their car. They had experienced some minor breakdown. Martin stopped his car, but not to help. He advised them to go to Port Arthur because it would be fun there soon. Port Arthur is a town in southeastern Tasmania. Its population is about 200 people. To the southeast of the town, across the strait, lies Tasman National Park. Port Arthur was known for housing a penal colony until 1877. After the closure of the penal colony, Port Arthur became a popular tourist destination. That's where Martin was heading. At the location, the young man entered a cafe called Broad Arrow, carrying a large blue sports bag on his back. He settled at a table on the balcony and ordered a large portion of food. After enjoying his meal, Martin went downstairs and surveyed the room. There weren't many visitors in the cafe. Spotting an empty table in the farthest corner, Martin headed toward it, took out a camera, pointed the lens toward the dining area, and pressed record. After this, he pulled an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle from the sports bag and, holding it against his hip, began shooting at the cafe's guests and staff. Within 15 seconds, 12 people fell dead, and another 10 were wounded. Then Martin left the cafe and crossed to the other side of the street, where he took the lives of 8 pedestrians and wounded 2 more. Throughout this ordeal, Martin remained completely calm, despite the chaos reigning around him. He unhurriedly got into his car, changed the magazine, and drove further down the streets, shooting random pedestrians from the window. When people tried to run away, Martin would give chase and still catch up with his victims. It didn't matter at all to him who was in front of him, man, woman, or minor. Martin drove 300 meters down the road and saw a woman with 2 children. He stopped and fired 2 shots. When the mother with the grandmother in her arms fell, the second girl tried to escape, but Martin easily caught up with the victim with 1 shot. Then he decided it would be good to change vehicles for disguise. He looked around and noticed a gold BMW in the parking lot. Martin wasn't bothered at all by the fact that there were 4 people inside the car. He took the lives of each one after another. After driving a short distance down the road, Martin saw a white Toyota with a man and woman inside. The shooter stopped next to the couple and, pulling out his weapon, ordered the man to get into the BMW's trunk. After the hostage followed the order, Martin slammed the lid shut and fired 2 shots into the white Toyota's windshield. The female driver died on the spot. Then Martin returned to the Seascape guest house with his hostage. He set the stolen car on fire so he wouldn't be discovered right away. The frightened man whom Martin had pulled from the BMW's trunk became even more terrified when he saw the mini hotel owners lying in pools of blood. Martin was quickly identified as the only shooting suspect. Soon he received a call from the police on his mobile phone. Despite his actions, they found him very quickly. The conversation lasted several hours until Martin's phone battery died. They offered him to surrender. They tried to find out what he wanted to achieve with his random shooting, but the young man never explained anything. The only demand he managed to voice was to be provided with a military helicopter to reach the airport, and then be given the opportunity to leave the country unhindered. Of course, the authorities had no intention of letting a criminal who had taken lives and wounded dozens of people escape. They tried to free the hostage, but Martin refused to release him. When communication was cut off, officers continued to stand outside. At that point, their main goal was to save the kidnapped man, and only then arrest the kidnapper. The police no longer had the ability to negotiate, but they were determined to rescue the hostage alive, although in reality, there was no one left to save. Martin had finished off the man immediately after talking with the police. On the next morning, 18 hours later, Martin realized he couldn't stay in this guest house forever. Then he decided to set the mini hotel on fire and escape during the chaos. The young man ran out through the back door. By that time, the fire was already rapidly spreading through the building. Martin's clothes caught fire, and he received burns to his back and buttocks. He was immediately captured and taken to the hospital for medical treatment. Enhanced security was stationed at the door of his room to prevent Martin from making another attempt to escape justice. Under strict supervision, the shooter was treated for his burns. Despite Martin's mental health issues and low intelligence level identified in previous psychiatric evaluations, he was found competent to stand trial. Initially, Martin didn't plead guilty to his actions, but Martin's sister and the court-appointed lawyer convinced the young man to accept all charges. The trial began on November 7, 1996. During his senseless shooting, this person ruthlessly sent 35 people to their deaths and wounded another 23 people. 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court judge sentenced him to 35 life sentences for each life taken, plus 1,652 years without the possibility of parole. All these sentences were to be served concurrently. Initially, Martin didn't take any of this seriously. He joked about his sentence in interviews, and it was completely obvious that the young man felt no remorse for any of his horrible acts. Martin behaved as if it was all a joke, and as if he hadn't destroyed the lives of dozens of families and taken away the future of 35 people. However, once the shooter found himself within prison walls, all his cheerfulness and carefreeness vanished. Martin very quickly came to the conclusion that he would rather die than spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the authorities were serious. They weren't going to allow him to choose an easy way out. So for the first 8 months, they kept him in a special cell with glass walls, so the inmate would be visible at all times. Then, Martin was transferred to a solitary cell and continued to be kept under individual monitoring for his own safety. The person who had taken others' lives had to fully experience all the hardships of imprisonment. Taking his own life would have freed him from punishment, however, this wasn't part of the authorities' plans. After 10 years behind bars, Martin was transferred to a new prison under the same conditions. And then, in November 2006, he was placed in a secure psychiatric hospital for inmates with severe mental disorders. Unlike prison, patients weren't locked in their rooms. They could move freely throughout the hospital grounds, while the outer perimeter was carefully controlled by armed guards. At first, Martin entertained himself by attacking other patients in the hospital, and in 2007 he got hold of a blade and tried to put an end to his joyless existence. This was his 5th attempt since being taken into custody. As in all other cases, the hospital staff intervened before he achieved success in his plan. However, just 2 days after this, he made his 6th attempt to take his own life. Martin again obtained a knife somewhere and slashed his throat. He was hospitalized and literally pulled back from death's door, after which he was transferred to the psychiatric ward of another prison. As of 2021, Martin is in a maximum security prison. His cell contains only soft objects, nothing sharp. Martin began gaining weight and losing his hair, but he continues to remain violent, both toward staff and other inmates. Recently, he broke a nurse's jaw, after which it was decided to keep him under heavy tranquilizers most of the time to reduce outbursts of anger and manifestations of violence. So now, instead of attacking people, the drugged Martin offers other inmates chocolate in exchange for intimate favors. Martin's mother, Carlson, visits her son every few weeks. She believes that if the young man hadn't lost his father, none of this would have happened. The woman has supported her son since the Port Arthur incident. Even before the trial began, Carlson tried to convince everyone that her boy couldn't have done this. She also claimed that the police had no evidence that Martin had ever been in Port Arthur. The woman probably didn't believe what she was saying herself. But in a 60-minute interview given before the trial began, she stubbornly insisted on Martin's innocence. And even despite the fact that her son had confessed to everything, Carlson tried to convince the public that the young man didn't know what he was doing, that he couldn't be taken at his word. Unlike his mother, Martin's sister, on the contrary, didn't support her brother in anything. She never doubted that he could carry out senseless shooting that affected dozens of innocent citizens. The young woman didn't want to be involved in this crime at all. She didn't want to be associated with Martin in any way, so she completely changed her name, quit her job, and moved away from home to avoid being associated with her brother's terrible legacy. The sister cut off all contacts and doesn't communicate with any of her former acquaintances. Friends, we have started a new channel and the first video has already been released on it. Please be as active as possible to support us. Thank you.